They wear crowns worth millions, live in palaces older than most countries, and yet they hoard Tupperware, talk to plants, and hold official titles like Raven Master. Welcome to the most absurd institution that somehow still exists, the British royal family. From codpieces to corgis, we're diving into 100 of the weirdest, wildest, and most wonderfully ridiculous facts lurking behind the royal curtain. You think you know royalty? Not like this. This isn't history. It's high tea with a side of madness. Grab your tiara. We're going in. Before we dive headfirst into royal weirdness, make sure you're subscribed. This rabbit hole goes deep, and you won't want to miss what's next. Also, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Midnight in Melbourne? Lunch break in London? We want to know who our royal court really is. 1. The monarchy owns all unmarked swans. Ah yes, nothing screams imperial dominance like claiming dibs on a bunch of birds. In England and Wales, if you see an unmarked swan paddling serenely across open waters, technically it belongs to the monarch. Not the lake owner, not the local council. The crown. That's right. The ruling dynasty of an island nation decided centuries ago that majestic floating neck noodles were royal property. But wait, it gets weirder. Every July, a select group of men in fancy blazers set sail on the River Thames for swan-upping, a centuries-old ceremonial census of Her Majesty's waterfowl. Armed with flags, boats, and a flair for pageantry, they catch swans, check their health, tag their legs, and release them back into the wild. The tradition is so specific, so deeply, unapologetically British, it sounds like a Monty Python sketch. But no, it's very real, and still taken very seriously. This tradition dates back to the 12th century, originally to prevent poaching, since swan meat was once a delicacy served at royal feasts. Today, the whole thing functions more like a slow-motion parade of conservation and symbolism. And yes, the monarch still technically owns them, except for the ones belonging to 2 specific London guilds, who apparently got lifetime bird privileges written into their medieval contracts. A bird census with medieval vibes? Quaint, regal, slightly unhinged. But if that's the bar, just wait till we talk about the Tower of London's winged doomsday insurance policy. 2. The Ravens of the Tower of London. If the ravens ever leave the Tower of London, the kingdom will fall. This isn't a poetic warning or a moody goth tattoo. This is an actual superstition that the British monarchy still honors, like officially. Welcome to one of the strangest insurance policies in history. The state-sanctioned protection of a half-dozen black birds with shiny feathers and zero respect for historical architecture. The legend claims that so long as at least 6 ravens remain at the tower, Britain will endure. The monarchy will stand. The nation will not crumble into a dystopian pile of tea bags and confused queuing. So, naturally, they have a Raven Master. That's a real title, by the way. The Raven Master lives on site and cares for the royal ravens like feathery, sarcastic celebrities. They get veterinary care. They eat raw meat and, hilariously, blood-soaked biscuits. Their wings are partially clipped so they won't fly too far, though each one has its own name and personality. There's even a list of former ravens who've been dismissed from service for misconduct, like escaping or attacking tourists. One legendary raven, George, was removed in 1986 for eating television aerials. It's a weird job, protecting a kingdom by babysitting smart, semi-flightless goth birds. But when the stakes are national collapse, you don't skimp on avian security. Still, ravens aren't the only animals to leave their mark on the monarchy. Let's take a walk with a man who loved his dog so much he rewrote the breed registry. And if you've made it this far past royal swans and feather-trimmed ravens, you're clearly one of us, hooked on the madness. So go ahead, hit that subscribe button and join the kingdom. Also, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it? Are you doom-scrolling at 2 a.m. or sipping tea at sunrise? We want to hear from the royal subjects worldwide. 3. Charles II and the Spaniels. Charles II didn't just like dogs, he was obsessed. If you were a courtier in Restoration England, you'd better make peace with fur on your silk breeches. Because wherever Charles went, a tiny army of floppy-eared spaniels trotted behind him like furry shadows. These were not just pets, they were fixtures of the throne, political accessories, fashionable mascots, and eventually, they became a breed that still carries his name, the Cavalier King Charles Spaniel. These dogs were pampered beyond belief. They lounged in royal chambers, napped on velvet cushions, and occasionally disrupted council meetings by leaping into the king's lap mid-debate. Parliament grumbled, nobles rolled their eyes, and satirists sharpened their quills. But Charles didn't care. In fact, he reportedly issued a royal decree that his beloved spaniels must be allowed in any public building in the kingdom, including Parliament. Centuries later, the breed has outlived the king by generations, but the name remains, a tribute to a monarch whose top priority may well have been belly rubs and loyalty with floppy ears. It's a touching legacy, but also kind of ridiculous. Still, if you think cuddling spaniels was Charles II's weirdest royal habit, oh boy. Let's talk about the centuries-long ritual of monarchs curing diseases with their literal hands. 4. The royal touch for the king's evil. Long before antibiotics or hand sanitizer, England had its own brand of medical drama, the royal touch. Imagine standing in a church courtyard, surrounded by hundreds of sick and hopeful souls, waiting for your sovereign to literally lay hands on you. For centuries, English and French kings performed this ritual, claiming divine power to cure scrofula, a type of tuberculosis known as the king's evil. The ceremony was equal parts faith, theater, and politics. Monarchs would process down aisles, touching each afflicted person while priests chanted prayers. Sometimes the king gave each recipient a gold touch piece, a coin said to seal the cure. It was miraculous branding, really, the idea that heaven itself had signed off on royal authority. Henry VII perfected the spectacle. Charles II turned it into a royal marathon. Records show that Charles touched more than 90,000 people in his lifetime. The line between medicine and monarchy blurred into something oddly spiritual. And even when the Enlightenment arrived, bringing science and skepticism, the power of tradition lingered. By the 18th century, though, the touch had lost its shine. Doctors rolled their eyes. Politicians quietly phased it out. But the myth of the healing king never really died. It just evolved into PR instead of prophecy. Still, there's something chillingly powerful about a nation that once lined up to be healed by its ruler's fingertips. And speaking of things the crown still technically owns, let's leave the touch behind and plunge into something much fishier. 5. The crown owns all royal fish. If you're fishing off the British coast and pull up a sturgeon or a whale, congratulations, you've just caught royal property. By ancient maritime law, all royal fish belong to the monarch. The rule was codified in the 14th century, and it still exists today. Why? Because medieval kings loved to eat like Poseidon on a holiday. Sturgeon and whales were considered noble feasts, symbols of divine abundance. So the crown declared them royal, a polite medieval way of saying, mine. The rule still holds. Technically, any whale or sturgeon caught within 3 miles of the UK's shore must be offered to the reigning monarch. It sounds absurdly specific, and it is, but the tradition's still referenced in modern legal circles. In 2004, a fisherman in Wales caught a rare sturgeon and, out of respect, or maybe sheer curiosity, sent a formal letter offering it to Queen Elizabeth II. Buckingham Palace politely declined. The term royal fish has survived wars, empires, and revolutions, like a strange barnacle of medieval logic still stuck to Britain's legal ship. It's one of those delightful royal quirks that remind us monarchy isn't just politics. It's centuries of habits that no one bothered to undo. And while the ocean may hide the crown's aquatic treasures, the next relic in this royal saga is something much smaller, but infinitely more sacred. A spoon that has anointed kings for nearly 1,000 years. 6. The coronation spoon. The oldest piece of Britain's crown jewels isn't a crown, a sword, or even a scepter. It's a spoon. A golden, jewel-encrusted, slightly curved relic that has survived rebellions, reformations, and regicides. Known simply as the coronation spoon, it's used to anoint every new monarch with holy oil. Simple? Yes. Symbolically nuclear? Absolutely. The spoon dates back to the 12th century, possibly even earlier. When Oliver Cromwell ordered the crown jewels melted down after the Civil War, this little piece somehow escaped destruction, reportedly sold to a private collector, then quietly returned when the monarchy was restored. At coronations, it holds sacred oil mixed from an ancient secret recipe, traditionally including ingredients like ambergris and cinnamon, though Charles III's was updated to a cruelty-free olive-based blend. The Archbishop of Canterbury dips the spoon, marks the monarch with oil, and just like that, divine right is renewed by way of a golden utensil. Think about it. Empires have risen and fallen, castles have crumbled, yet this one medieval spoon keeps showing up, front and center, as power changes hands. It's ceremonial minimalism at its finest, a small, shining reminder that even the grandest traditions can hinge on something humble. And if you think a 12th century spoon is an odd royal obsession, wait until you meet a king whose fashion statement could double as a medieval weapon. 7. Henry VIII's codpieces. Ah, the Renaissance. A golden age of art, exploration, and aggressively oversized groin armor. Enter Henry VIII, England's most famous marital overachiever and one of history's boldest fashion icons. Among his more memorable sartorial choices was the codpiece, a padded protruding flap of fabric or metal that covered the crotch area of a man's trousers. In Henry's case, it wasn't just a functional garment. It was a full-blown statement piece. Early codpieces were humble, modest little triangles stitched in for decency as men's hemlines rose. But by the time Henry VIII was stomping around in full Tudor splendor, the codpiece had evolved into a symbolic power move. Henry's codpieces, especially those affixed to his suits of armor, were large, exaggerated, and unmistakably intentional. Why? Well, fashion was one part of it. Early 16th century trends were all about masculine dominance, and the codpiece became a literal focal point. It also served practical purposes. Some believe it housed medicinal herbs or served as a kind of pocket. But with Henry, it was more than that. His codpiece was propaganda, a flashy declaration of strength, potency, and unshakable virility, just in case the crown and 6 wives hadn't made it clear enough. His armor at the Tower of London even includes a codpiece so prominent it's hard not to laugh, or wince. Crafted in gleaming metal, it juts forward with the bravado of a monarch who knew every inch of his image was political theater. So yes, Henry VIII's codpiece lives on, not just in museums, but in every cartoon caricature and historical meme that ever dared to exaggerate the already exaggerated. Its fashion, its history, its royal overcompensation on parade. But the Tudors weren't all iron and ego. Some of their legacy is delightfully domestic, like the Queen who turned Britain into a nation of tea drinkers. 8. Catherine of Braganza and tea time. Before Britain became the tea capital of the Western world, its national beverage was, wait for it, beer. Morning, noon, and night, beer was the drink of choice. Enter Catherine of Braganza, a Portuguese princess with impeccable style, diplomatic savvy, and an unshakable love of tea. When she married Charles II in 1662, Catherine brought more than a royal dowry. She brought her tea-drinking habit, a Portuguese tradition that immediately caught the attention of the English court. In an era where imports screamed luxury, tea was still rare, expensive, and exotic. everything the Restoration Court adored. Catherine's devotion to the brew didn't go unnoticed. Soon, noble ladies were sipping tea in imitation, and the trend trickled down to the middle classes. By the 18th century, tea wasn't just fashionable, it was national. And Catherine? She was the original influencer, the Duchess of Darjeeling, the Empress of Earl Grey, figuratively speaking. Tea drinking quickly took on rituals: porcelain cups, silver strainers, tiered trays of delicacies. It wasn't just a beverage, it was an event. And while the British Empire would later use tea as a geopolitical tool, hello Boston, its domestic roots can be traced back to one Portuguese queen who missed the taste of home. Thanks to Catherine, Britain didn't just develop a tea habit, it built a tea identity, one polite sip at a time. And speaking of royal habits with undignified endings, let's pivot to a monarch who went out in a way no biographer can ever resist mentioning. Because yes, the king really died there. 9. George II died on the toilet. There are royal exits, and then there's this. In 1760, King George II became the only British monarch known to have died on the toilet. Not exactly how you expect a king's reign to end, but here we are. The official cause was an aortic aneurysm, a sudden fatal rupture of a major blood vessel. But the setting? The royal privy at Kensington Palace. History, bless it, loves its poetic ironies. George II had ruled for over 3 decades, weathering wars, palace drama, and the rise of Handel's music. But in the end, it was an undignified moment of solitude that took him down. One minute, he was reading the London papers. The next, he was gone. Despite the location, his death was not considered scandalous, just sudden. Court doctors confirmed the medical cause, and the kingdom moved on with its usual mix of mourning and political reshuffling. Still, the bathroom detail never quite faded. It became one of those odd historical footnotes that sticks in the public imagination, immortalized by trivia buffs and the occasional smirking historian. And while it's tempting to laugh, there's something oddly human about it. Kings, they're just like us. They rule, they rage, they sign declarations. And yes, sometimes they meet their end in the least regal of places. George II's peculiar departure didn't tarnish the monarchy, though. If anything, it made the royals seem a bit more mortal. Before the next generation ushered in a palace so outrageous, so wildly flamboyant, it looked like it belonged in a Wes Anderson fever dream. 10. George IV and the Brighton Pavilion. Most royal palaces say, power. The Brighton Pavilion says, I am the main character of a fever dream set in a porcelain jungle. Built by George IV when he was still Prince Regent, the Royal Pavilion in Brighton isn't just an architectural oddity, it's a maximalist fantasy turned stone. Picture this: onion domes, minarets, and swirling Mughal motifs outside, dragons, gold leaf, and silk canopies inside. It's part Indian palace, part Chinese tea house, and 100% the product of one man's taste for the dramatic. George IV, once described as the first gentleman of Europe, was not known for his restraint. He loved fashion, he loved luxury, and above all, he loved spectacle. And the pavilion was his crown jewel of indulgence. What began as a modest seaside retreat exploded into a full-scale palace makeover when architect John Nash got involved. The final result? A surreal fusion of Orientalist fantasy and Regency glam. Inside, no surface goes undecorated. Chandeliers hang from lotus flowers. Walls bloom with painted birds and foliage. Banquet halls shimmer under exotic-themed decor. It's not British exactly, but that's the point. George wanted a palace that reflected his cultivated persona, worldly, artistic, and a bit untouchable. Of course, the pavilion was controversial even then. Critics called it excessive. Some called it embarrassing. But it's still standing. One of the strangest, Most striking royal buildings in Europe. A bizarre, beautiful artifact of royal self-expression with zero chill. And while George IV may have left behind a fantasy palace, he also kept other ancient traditions very much alive, like opening Parliament with a language nobody actually speaks. 11. Norman French in Parliament. Every year the monarch opens Parliament with pomp, pageantry, and medieval gibberish. During the state opening of Parliament, once the monarch reads the speech from the throne, a bizarre little flourish follows, the formal response of the Lords, expressed in Norman French. La reine le veut, they declare. Translation: the Queen wills it. Or now, with Charles III, le roi le veut. No, this isn't a cosplay ritual for history nerds. It's a living, breathing part of British constitutional theater. Norman French was the language of English law and governance after the Norman conquest in 1066. And while the rest of the country moved on to modern English centuries ago, Parliament decided this one archaic phrase was simply too iconic to let go. It's ceremonial now, of course. No one's writing legislation in French anymore. But that stubborn little phrase serves a purpose. It connects modern monarchy to its medieval roots with one absurdly outdated soundbite. It's legal tradition as historical cosplay. And the linguistic weirdness doesn't stop there. The whole state opening of Parliament is a masterclass in ritual theater. Robes, trumpets, horse-drawn carriages, and a crown that travels on its own velvet cushion. All that tradition is designed to signal continuity, legitimacy, and let's face it, theatrical flair. So yes, the monarch technically still speaks French once a year. Barely. But what comes next is even more dramatic. A door slammed in the face of royalty, followed by one of the most ritualized knocks in Britain. 12. Black Rod and the Slammed Door. Knock knock. Who's there? Authority. Authority who? Authority that needs to be reminded where it stands. Every year, during the state opening of Parliament, a royal official, known as Black Rod, marches from the House of Lords to the Commons to summon MPs for the monarch's speech. But when they arrive, tradition kicks in. The doors to the House of Commons are slammed shut in their face. Hard. Why? It's not rudeness, it's symbolism. The slamming of the door represents the independence of the Commons from the monarchy. It's Parliament's way of saying, we'll listen, but on our terms. Once the door is closed, Black Rod raises their staff, knocks 3 times, and then, only then, are they allowed inside. It's ritual theater at its finest, equal parts resistance and respect. The Commons eventually follows Black Rod back to the Lords, filing into their seats like kids being called to assembly. But those 3 knocks? They echo centuries of political tension. A reminder that the British monarchy may reign, but it doesn't rule, not without Parliament. Black Rod themselves is no minor functionary. The position dates back to the 14th century, and the staff they carry, the actual rod, is a symbol of office, topped with a lion and capped with historical gravitas. In recent years, Black Rod has even been portrayed by women for the first time in history, adding a modern twist to this ancient ritual. So yes, it's one big, dramatic, door-slamming, staff-tapping performance. But it means something. It tells you that the monarchy doesn't enter the Commons uninvited. And speaking of controlling time and tradition, the next royal quirk takes place not in a courtroom or a palace, but on a shooting estate with clocks that lie. 13. Sandringham time. What do you do when you're king and the day just doesn't feel long enough? If you're Edward VII, you change time itself. In the early 1900s, at his royal estate in Norfolk, Edward decided that standard time was getting in the way of his hobbies, namely shooting game birds. So he invented his own time zone. Seriously, he set all the clocks at Sandringham House 30 minutes fast. Why? So the sun would rise earlier, giving him more daylight for shooting before afternoon tea. It was called Sandringham time, and for decades it was law. Well, not actual law, but practically enforced. Staff, guests, and even the church on the estate had to follow it. The clocks were all adjusted, including tower clocks, household bells, and even servants' schedules. Miss a cue? You were 30 minutes behind His Majesty's version of reality. When Edward VII died, his son George V kept the tradition going. Royal visitors had to remember to mentally shift forward half an hour while staying at Sandringham. It was the royal equivalent of living in a different time dimension, one where birds got nervous earlier than usual. Eventually, Edward VIII scrapped the whole thing during his brief reign, probably to simplify the logistics of, well, everything. But for over 30 years, Sandringham ran on a kind of royal jet lag, a temporal flex by a king who didn't want daylight savings, but daylight sovereignty. It's a little absurd, a little brilliant, and yet another reminder that royal power isn't just about laws or land. Sometimes it's about making time itself bend to your leisure. And speaking of birds and bending time, the next royal tradition involves a place named after hawks, but now filled with horses, carriages, and pomp. 14. The Crown Mews and Molting Hawks. The royal mews is where the monarchy keeps its wheels, specifically the grand gilded carriages used for coronations, state openings, and other ultra-ceremonial events. But the name? That's a callback to a very different kind of passenger. Hawks. Mews comes from the French word moure, meaning to molt. In the Middle Ages, the royal falcons were housed in a special aviary while they shed old feathers and grew new ones. These birds weren't just royal pets. They were high-status hunting companions, especially prized by medieval kings. Falconry was the ultimate power hobby. Over time, as hawking fell out of fashion and carriages came into vogue, the building's purpose shifted, but the name stuck. So now, when you hear royal mews, you're not hearing stable or garage. You're hearing a centuries-old echo of molting birds with noble pedigrees. Today, the Royal Mews at Buckingham Palace is a working stables complex. It's home to the Gold State Coach, the glittering, uncomfortable monstrosity last used at Charles III's coronation, modern limousines, and the horses that pull them. The carriages are meticulously maintained, the horses impeccably trained, and yes, everything is coordinated down to the second during major events. But the term mews is one of those delightful quirks the monarchy never bothered to modernize. Why call it a carriage house when you can keep using a word that sounds mysterious and medieval? And if you think that's delightfully obscure, wait until you learn what the Queen might keep just behind the wallpaper. Convenient for emergencies and very, very discreet. 15. The Palace ATM. There are things you expect to find in Buckingham Palace: chandeliers, portraits, guards in fuzzy hats. But an ATM? Yes, reportedly, Queen Elizabeth II had a private cash machine installed at Buckingham Palace, courtesy of her personal bank, Coutts. It wasn't exactly in the entrance hall with the corgis. It was discreetly tucked away, somewhere out of view but accessible to senior royals in need of a little quick cash. Coutts is no ordinary bank. It's the ultra-elite financial institution that serves the monarchy and other members of the aristocracy. Having an ATM at home is less about flexing wealth, although, let's be honest, it kind of is, and more about convenience in the most royal sense. Did the Queen herself ever use it? That's unclear. But the mere fact it existed is pure royal absurdity. It's like installing a vending machine in Versailles. Sure, it's possible, but why? For most of her reign, Elizabeth II was famously frugal in small ways, reusing wrapping paper, turning off lights, and packing cereal in Tupperware. But the Palace ATM sits at that bizarre intersection of royal necessity and excessive charm. Because when you're the head of state and the boss of a centuries-old estate empire, sometimes you just need 20 quid without the press knowing. It's not the only oddball job the palace has to account for. From piper to equerry, the royal household runs like a mini-city, And keeping time inside that city? That requires a clock master. 16. The Palace Horologist. In a place where time is a matter of ceremony, you don't just need a clock, you need a clock whisperer. Enter the Royal Horologist, a full-time position dedicated solely to the maintenance of the monarchy's mind-boggling collection of clocks. At Buckingham Palace alone, there are over 350 of them. Add in Windsor, Balmoral, Sandringham, and Clarence House, and you've got one of the largest private clock collections in the world, all of which need to be wound, cleaned, and set manually. And yes, it's as intense as it sounds. Twice a year, during the switch to and from daylight saving time, the Royal Horologist performs a time ballet. Every clock is checked, every pendulum adjusted, each minute hand nudged with microscopic precision. It's not just about keeping time, it's about keeping tradition. Some of these clocks are antiques from the Georgian era, and they're still ticking because of one very specialized royal employee. This isn't just a guy with a pocket watch and a screwdriver. The horologist is part technician, part conservator, and part historian. They work in silence, often alone, surrounded by gilded mantles, marble floors, and centuries of ticking. What makes it all so charmingly ridiculous is that the royal family, like everyone else, has smartphones and digital clocks. But that doesn't matter. The palace doesn't run on Google. It runs on legacy. In royal residences, time isn't just kept, it's honored. And when the chimes ring out across Buckingham's halls, they're echoing through centuries of tick-tock tradition. But the clocks are just one cog in the royal morning machinery. Step outside the tick-tock chamber and into the royal corridors, and you might just hear something stranger. The sound of a lone bagpipe, played beneath a window at dawn. 17. The royal piper and physician of the household only. In the British monarchy, could bagpipes be considered a morning alarm? Every weekday morning at precisely 9 a.m., a royal piper plays beneath the monarch's window. This tradition began with Queen Victoria, who fell in love with the sound of Scottish pipes echoing through the corridors of Balmoral. She brought the tradition south to London, and it never left. The piper to the sovereign is a real job. They're a serving member of the armed forces, usually from a Scottish regiment, and their daily serenade lasts 15 minutes. Rain or shine, royal event or not, they play their set outside the window where the monarch is staying. This isn't just ceremonial fluff. It's deeply personal. Queen Elizabeth II kept the tradition alive for 70 years. It became one of her favorite customs, something quietly human in the machinery of monarchy. The role even continues under King Charles III. And while the piper wakes you up with musical resolve, there's someone else behind the curtain managing the physical realm of royal life, the physician of the household. This doctor isn't just there for checkups. They're part of the royal entourage, always on standby. The position dates back centuries, evolving from a medieval herbalist to a modern physician with high-clearance access and a royal bedside manner. Together, the piper and the physician represent two sides of palace life, tradition and practicality. One plays a tune to wake a king, the other makes sure he lives to hear it. And while those roles are high profile within the royal walls, some of the most enduring images of royal loyalty come not from humans, but from a tiny dog hidden beneath the hem of tragedy. 18. Mary, Queen of Scots' little terrier. It's a haunting detail from a grim chapter of royal history. When Mary, Queen of Scots, was executed in 1587, her beloved little dog, reportedly a Skye Terrier, was found hiding beneath her skirts. Mary's final moments were the stuff of solemn ritual and political controversy. But what no one expected was that, after the blade had fallen, a loyal little dog emerged from under her gown, refusing to leave her side. According to eyewitnesses, the terrier was covered in blood and grief-stricken, curled against the Queen's body. The image became an instant symbol. In an age of dynastic violence and shifting loyalties, here was a creature embodying absolute devotion. It was poignant, poetic, and just the tiniest bit surreal. How the dog got there is still debated. Some say Mary smuggled it in as a comfort for her final hours. Others believe the dog clung to her in the chaos. Either way, it refused to be separated from its mistress, even in death. It was eventually washed and cared for by her ladies-in-waiting, reportedly refusing food for days. In art and lore, Mary's little terrier became more than a pet. It became a symbol of innocent loyalty amidst betrayal and power plays. While monarchs battled over crowns and borders, the dog simply stayed. It's a rare, raw moment in royal history, one that doesn't involve crowns or ceremonies, but something quietly human. And yet, royalty being royalty, sentiment and symbolism often come wrapped in fashion statements. Let's step into a world of wigs, powder, and some of the most iconic makeup choices ever painted onto a sovereign face. 19. Elizabeth I and the painted persona. Elizabeth I didn't just rule England, she curated herself into myth. At the heart of her carefully constructed image was an unforgettable aesthetic. Ghostly white face paint, blazing red wigs, and gowns so elaborate they looked sculpted. Her appearance was not a mirror of the woman beneath. It was a performance, a weaponized illusion of eternal youth and divine authority. Let's start with the face. Elizabeth's signature pale complexion was achieved using ceruse, a white lead-based makeup that, while undeniably toxic, created the desired porcelain effect. Combined with rouge, a dab of lip color, and penciled-in veins, yes, blue veins, delicately painted to give a translucent goddess vibe, the queen transformed her face into a canvas of power. But this wasn't vanity, it was strategy. As a woman ruling alone in a male-dominated world, Elizabeth knew the importance of perception. She became the Virgin Queen, a monarch above mortal flaws, untouched by time. Her red wigs, towering and curled, added to the theatricality. She wore them long after her natural hair thinned, creating an image of youth long after youth had gone. Her wardrobe was equally legendary. At one point, she owned over 2,000 dresses, each one designed to dazzle, intimidate, or communicate allegiance. Pearls symbolized purity. Suns and moons hinted at celestial power. Every thread was message-laden. By the end of her reign, Elizabeth wasn't just a queen. She was a living icon, woven from lace, legend, and luminous lead paint. But not all royal creatures were draped in silk and ceremony. Some had claws, and fur, and in one case, a leash leading into the river Thames. 20. The Royal Menagerie and the Polar Bear in the Thames. Before London had the Natural History Museum, it had the Tower of London. And before that tower held prisoners or jewels, it held lions and leopards, and one extremely confused polar bear. Welcome to the Royal Menagerie, a medieval zoo built for monarchs who wanted the world's wildest animals parked in their backyard. The collection started in the 13th century when King John received 3 leopards as a gift from the Holy Roman Emperor. Over the next few reigns, the animal roster grew. Lions, lynxes, monkeys, elephants. The Tower of London became a roaring, screeching, paw-swiping spectacle of royal exoticism. But nothing quite topped the polar bear. In the mid-1200s, Henry III was gifted a white bear, likely a polar bear, by the King of Norway. Instead of keeping it caged, Henry had an idea. Why not let it swim and hunt? So, the bear was fitted with a long leash and taken down to the River Thames, where it was allowed to fish in the cold waters. Yes, really. A tethered polar bear bobbing through the foggy river, terrifying fish and passers-by alike. The menagerie eventually became a public curiosity. For a few pence, You could visit and marvel at creatures most medieval Londoners had only heard about in fables. The animals, however, didn't fare so well. Conditions were rough and accidents were common, especially with the lions. By the 1800s, the whole operation was shut down, and the animals were moved to what would become the London Zoo. But the Tower's strange stint as a medieval wildlife park lives on in stories, legends, and a statue of that famous polar bear near the old moat. Yet while kings collected beasts and queens painted their faces into mythology, one monarch's tragedy stood apart, not just in scale, but in heartbreaking repetition. 21. Queen Anne and 17 lost children. Queen Anne holds a grim record in royal history. She was pregnant 17 times. 17. And none of her children lived to see adulthood. The numbers are staggering. 7 miscarriages, 5 stillbirths, 5 children who died in infancy or early childhood. The longest surviving was Prince William, Duke of Gloucester, who lived to age 11 before dying from a sudden illness. Each loss was personal and political. Anne was the last of the Stuart monarchs, and with every death, the royal succession grew more fragile. Her struggles weren't hidden. They were lived out in real time, under the scrutiny of courtiers and foreign ambassadors. Her health declined, physically and emotionally, and her frequent pregnancies left her in chronic pain. Still, she carried on, ruling as sovereign in a time of war, shifting alliances, and intense pressure to produce an heir. But the nursery remained empty. Anne's grief shaped her reign. She became increasingly reclusive, leaning on favorites like Sarah Churchill for emotional support. Portraits from the era often show her in dark clothing, with sad eyes and a weary expression that doesn't quite align with the grandeur around her. And when she died in 1714, the lack of a surviving heir ended the direct Stuart line, forcing Parliament to reach across Europe to bring in the Hanoverians. Anne's story is not often spotlighted, overshadowed by flashier monarchs. But behind the court drama and powdered wigs was a woman who endured more personal loss than nearly any other figure in royal history. And from personal tragedy, we now pivot to a king who barely spoke the language of his realm, and gave his mistresses some of the oddest nicknames ever whispered in royal bedchambers. 22. George I and the Elephant and the Maypole. When George I arrived in Britain to take the throne in 1714, he brought with him a solid claim to the crown and a complete inability to speak English. The first king from the House of Hanover, George I, was plucked from Germany by Parliament due to his Protestant bloodline. Never mind that he'd barely set foot in England. He ruled over a nation he didn't understand, in a language he couldn't speak, surrounded by ministers who found him baffling and a public that found him aloof. But what George lacked in charm, he made up for in eccentricity. He traveled with a rotating entourage of courtiers, German cooks, and, most memorably, 2 mistresses whom the British press quickly dubbed the Elephant and the Maypole. The nicknames weren't kind. One was described as large and imposing, the other tall and spindly. The British public, never known for subtlety, made them instant tabloid fodder. George reportedly found great comfort in their company, even as his court muttered behind closed doors. And while his grasp of English never improved, he had an uncanny instinct for retaining power. He left governance largely to his ministers, inadvertently paving the way for Britain's modern parliamentary system. Still, George I remained a distant figure. He preferred his meals in German, his policies in silence, and his mistresses, with nicknames so odd they'd sound more fitting for a circus act than a royal romance. But while George preferred quiet influence, his grandson would help transform London into a global stage, starting with a glass palace that looked like something from the future. 23. Prince Albert and the Great Exhibition of 1851. When Prince Albert proposed an international exhibition in Hyde Park, the idea sounded ambitious, maybe even insane. But Albert, husband to Queen Victoria, thinker, reformer, and champion of industry, had a vision. He wanted to showcase the triumphs of science, technology, and design from around the globe. The result was the Great Exhibition of 1851, the world's first international expo, and a massive flex of Victorian innovation. At the heart of it stood the Crystal Palace, a towering structure made entirely of glass and iron. It was unlike anything anyone had seen, a transparent cathedral of progress, 990,000 square feet in size, assembled with precision and speed that shocked the world. Inside were over 100,000 exhibits, machinery, textiles, jewels, furniture, and curiosities from every corner of the empire and beyond. The exhibition drew over 6 million visitors, equivalent to a third of the British population at the time. It was a cultural phenomenon. Royals mingled with working-class families. Inventors demoed new devices. Global representatives brought art and artifacts. And all of it stood beneath sunlight pouring through sheets of crystal-clear glass. Prince Albert didn't just organize a trade show. He helped redefine Britain's image as a modern, forward-thinking empire. The profits from the exhibition funded the foundation of South Kensington's museums, institutions like the V&A and the Natural History Museum. And while Victoria often gets the limelight, this was Albert's moment. His fingerprints were on every bolt and beam, from the architecture to the layout to the ideals behind it. The Great Exhibition wasn't just about what humanity had achieved. It was a promise of what it could. And as we wander from the sparkling panes of the Crystal Palace, we arrive in Scotland, where Albert's next great project was more stone than glass, but no less ambitious. 24. Balmoral and the Scottish Fantasy. If the Great Exhibition was Prince Albert's tribute to modernity, Balmoral was his love letter to the past. Nestled in the Scottish Highlands, Balmoral Castle wasn't just a summer getaway, it was a stage set of romantic nationalism. When Albert and Victoria bought the estate in 1852, they didn't just move in, they rebuilt it, reshaping the landscape and architecture into a medievalist fantasy straight out of a Walter Scott novel. The style? Scottish baronial. Think turrets, battlements, gables, and granite. A castle that looked ancient but was entirely Victorian in design. Albert helped draft blueprints, approved stonework, and even dictated furniture details. This wasn't decoration, it was identity. A German prince crafting a royal Scottish castle to forge a British image. Victoria fell in love. With the land, with the culture, with the imagined simplicity of Highland life. She wore tartan, held Seeleys, and wrote diary entries that made the place sound like paradise. But Balmoral wasn't just aesthetics, it was sanctuary. Here, the royal family could escape the politics of London and play at country life while still enjoying the luxury of royal command. They hunted, painted, picnicked, and posed for now iconic photographs that helped humanize the monarchy for a Victorian public. To this day, Balmoral remains a private residence for the royal family, more personal than regal, more retreat than court. From shimmering glass palaces to granite Highland fantasies, Albert reshaped the monarchy's image for a new era. But perhaps his most culture-changing contribution came not from what he built, but what he and Victoria brought to the living room of nearly every British home, a fir tree draped in lights. 25. Queen Victoria and the Christmas tree craze. Before Queen Victoria, Christmas in Britain was cozy, quiet, and surprisingly treeless. But that all changed thanks to a single engraving and a German tradition smuggled into the palace by marriage. Prince Albert, being German, grew up with the custom of decorating evergreen trees during Christmas. In 1848, the Illustrated London News published a sketch of Victoria Albert and their children gathered around a lavishly adorned Christmas tree at Windsor Castle. The public went wild. Middle-class families across Britain raced to emulate the royal scene. Within a decade, the Christmas tree went from foreign oddity to national staple. Victoria and Albert's tree was no mere fir. It was a beacon of Victorian sentimentality. Decorated with candles, sweets, glass ornaments, and small gifts, it transformed the holiday from a religious observance into a festive family affair. Combined with other traditions, like crackers, cards, and carols, the Christmas tree helped shape the modern British Christmas. Albert was often the architect, but Victoria was the brand. Her approval turned quaint customs into trends. And the tree? It became a symbol of domestic bliss and imperial charm, dripping with Victorian ideals about family, piety, and, let's face it, showing off just a bit. Even today, Windsor Castle and Buckingham Palace still host Christmas trees, towering tributes to a tradition that started with a prince missing his childhood customs, and a queen savvy enough to make them fashionable. But as the tree lights twinkled, the royal mood would darken after Albert's death. What followed was one of the longest mourning periods in royal history. Black dresses, black veils, and a queen who never stopped grieving. 26. Queen Victoria's Mourning Black. When Prince Albert died in 1861, Queen Victoria didn't just grieve. She cloaked an entire empire in sorrow. For nearly 40 years, Victoria wore black, jet black, every day. From her headdress to her boots, she dressed as a widow queen, wrapped in mourning like it was royal armor. And she wasn't subtle about it. Her grief wasn't just personal, it was public, visible, and persistent. This was more than etiquette. Mourning fashion was serious business in the 19th century, with elaborate codes for how long and how deeply one should mourn, depending on the relationship. But Victoria didn't follow the book, she rewrote it. Her mourning wasn't confined to months or years. It became her uniform. She withdrew from public life, shunning many of her ceremonial duties. For years, her presence was a whisper behind veils, glimpsed only rarely. Critics called her the Widow of Windsor. Newspapers questioned her absence. But the public, oddly, respected it. Her mourning humanized her, made her relatable. It turned a monarch into a grieving woman, an image rarely seen before or since. Her court followed suit. Ladies-in-waiting dressed in black. Portraits showed her pale and solemn, even Buckingham Palace dimmed in tone. The mood of a nation took its cues from its queen. Over time, she gradually resumed public life, but she never abandoned black. When she died in 1901, she was buried in her mourning clothes, alongside a lock of Albert's hair and his dressing gown. A final, quiet echo of a love story that never faded. Yet despite the somber tone, there was something quietly triumphant in her image. At just under 5 feet tall, this tiny woman loomed over the 19th century like a statue. And now, let's meet the monarch who may have been small in stature, but cast a shadow that's still felt today. 27. Queen Victoria, 4'11" of imperial might. She stood barely 4 feet 11 inches tall. But don't let that fool you. Queen Victoria was a colossus in corsets. Born in 1819 and ascending the throne at just 18, Victoria ruled for over 63 years, an era so expansive it took her name. The Victorian age wasn't just a chapter of British history, it was British history for most of the 19th century. And yes, she was tiny. So tiny, in fact, that visiting dignitaries reportedly had to suppress their surprise upon meeting her. But what she lacked in height, she made up for in iron will, strategic alliances, and an uncanny ability to remain both regal and relatable. Victoria navigated wars, revolutions, scientific breakthroughs, and the expansion of the British Empire to its largest extent. Under her, Britain became the most powerful nation on earth. She redefined monarchy, moving it away from the scandal-plagued courts of the 18th century and toward a more moral, family-oriented image. Despite personal struggles, like her legendary mourning and frequent illnesses, she remained a cultural juggernaut. Painters painted her, poets praised her, children across the empire sang her name, and she used her image, Her diminutive size made her seem grandmotherly. Her widowhood made her appear sympathetic. Her visibility, though carefully staged, made her feel ever-present. She wasn't just the queen, she was the grandmother of Europe. Literally. Her descendants married into nearly every royal house on the continent. So while she may have needed a footstool to mount a horse, Victoria stood tall in every other way. Her legacy still haunts the monarchy, the museums, and the Christmas tree in your living room. And speaking of things that might be small but pack a legacy, let's peek inside the most exquisitely tiny palace ever built for dolls. 28. Queen Mary and the Dollhouse of Dreams. Queen Mary, wife of George V and grandmother to Elizabeth II, had a passion for miniatures that went far beyond teacups and trinkets. She adored tiny things, especially ones that mirrored real life with perfect, obsessive detail. And in 1924, that love culminated in one of the most elaborate and absurdly delightful royal projects ever built, Queen Mary's dollhouse. But let's be clear, this was no toy. Standing over 5 feet wide and nearly as tall, Queen Mary's dollhouse was a gift from architect Sir Edwin Lutyens and a team of over 1,500 artists, designers, and craftspeople. It was meant as a tribute to British artistry and craftsmanship, disguised as a dollhouse. Every room is a marvel. There's running water in the miniature bathrooms. Electricity lights the chandeliers. The library holds tiny books, each one written by real authors like Rudyard Kipling and Arthur Conan Doyle. The wine cellar has hundreds of tiny labeled bottles. The kitchen is fully stocked with utensils. The garage holds model cars with working parts, and even the garden is landscaped to scale. This dollhouse is a microcosm of Edwardian life, a Downton Abbey compressed into a display case. Every drawer opens, every hinge works. Even the plumbing is functional, though not thankfully in use. Queen Mary's dollhouse isn't just a monument to miniatures. It's a time capsule, a royal fantasy frozen in place. Today it sits in Windsor Castle, still one of the most popular attractions. Proof that even the most powerful monarchs sometimes just want a really, really fancy dollhouse. But while Queen Mary collected miniatures, she also helped launch a royal rebranding so effective it erased centuries of German roots with one sturdy English word, Windsor. 29. From Saxe-Coburg to Windsor. By 1917, the First World War had turned German into a dirty word in Britain. And unfortunately for the royal family, their actual surname, Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, sounded about as German as a bratwurst in lederhosen. So King George V did what any savvy monarch would do in a PR crisis. He changed the brand. On July 17, 1917, he issued a royal proclamation renouncing all German titles and adopting a new house name. The royal family would henceforth be known as the House of Windsor, a name borrowed not from some ancient royal bloodline, but from a castle. It was short, English, strong, and above all, non-German. The move was brilliant. It distanced the monarchy from its Teutonic cousins, particularly awkward given that George V was a first cousin to Kaiser Wilhelm II, and aligned it more closely with the British public. Windsor became synonymous with patriotism and duty, even as bombs fell from German aircraft bearing names like Gotha. The rebrand didn't stop there. Other royals anglicized their surnames. Titles were shuffled or stripped entirely. Suddenly, the British monarchy seemed, well, more British, and the House of Windsor stuck. A century later, it still stands as the reigning dynasty. It's one of the most successful image makeovers in history. No press conference, no tears, just a royal decree and a very sturdy castle name. And while George V was making royal history with paperwork, his granddaughter would eventually rewrite the rules of royal driving by hopping into a truck and changing a tire. 30. Elizabeth II, the Queen without a license. Elizabeth II didn't just break the mold, she drove over it. During World War II, before she ever wore a crown, young Princess Elizabeth joined the Auxiliary Territorial Service, Britain's women's branch of the Army. Her role? Mechanic and truck driver. At 18, she rolled up her sleeves, learned to fix engines, change tires, and navigate heavy vehicles through wartime Britain. She was the first female royal to serve in the armed forces and the only one to do so in active military service during the war. That training came with a bonus. She learned to drive. But here's where it gets gloriously royal. Once she became queen, she never needed a driver's license. In fact, she was the only person in the UK legally allowed to drive without one. Why? Because licenses are issued in the monarch's name. You can't issue one to yourself. It's an odd legal quirk, but a deeply symbolic one. The Queen didn't just rule the realm, she was the law, and drive she did. Elizabeth II loved being behind the wheel, particularly in her beloved Land Rovers. At Balmoral, she'd famously go off-road, barreling through the Scottish countryside like a duchess in a Defender commercial. No security detail, no chauffeur. Just Liz, the wheel, and the wilderness. She drove heads of state. She surprised bodyguards. She once even gave Saudi royalty, who at the time weren't used to women drivers, a royal tour from the driver's seat. The message was clear. This queen wasn't ornamental. She was horsepower in pearls. And if you think that's modern, wait until you hear about the Royal Olympians who brought home medals and proved that royalty knows how to ride. 31. Princess Anne, Royal Olympian. Princess Anne didn't just wave from the royal balcony, she galloped into Olympic history. In 1976, the Queen's only daughter became the first member of the British royal family to compete in the Olympic Games. Her sport? Eventing, a demanding equestrian discipline that combines dressage, cross-country, and show jumping. It's one of the toughest events in the equestrian world, and Anne didn't just enter it for fun. She was a serious competitor, having already won the individual European title in 1971. At the Montreal Olympics, Anne rode the Queen's horse, Goodwill. And while she didn't take home a medal, her presence on the field was groundbreaking. She competed as a full athlete, not a royal guest. No special treatment, just grit, reins, and rain. Her performance was solid, despite suffering a concussion mid-course that she famously rode through, finishing the event without even remembering parts of it. That's commitment, or insanity, possibly both. Years later, her daughter Zara Phillips would carry on the legacy, winning a silver medal in the same event at the 2012 London Olympics. Anne, by then a seasoned sports administrator, was the one who presented the medal, becoming the rare mother to hand her own child an Olympic honor on live television. Anne's sporting life is just one facet of her legacy. She's also known for her sharp wit, low tolerance for fluff, and steadfast sense of duty. But it was that Olympic moment, mud-splattered, helmeted, entirely unscripted, that captured the world's attention. And while Anne was making history on horseback, royal lore was brewing about something far more anatomical. A piece of jewelry? A medical curiosity? A persistent legend with one very royal name. 32. The Prince Albert piercing, yes, that one. Of all the royal legends that refuse to die, the most eyebrow-raising has to be the story of the Prince Albert. Not the man, though he was Queen Victoria's deeply loved consort, but the piercing. Yes, that one. According to rumor, Prince Albert popularized a certain male body piercing supposedly used to secure one's regal parts, neatly within tight trousers. The legend goes that Victorian fashion demanded such extreme tailoring, particularly in court dress, that a gentleman's silhouette needed tidying up. Hence, the piercing. Or so they say. Is it true? Probably not. There's zero solid historical evidence that Prince Albert ever wore, or even endorsed, such a thing. The story seems to have emerged in the late 20th century, long after his death, as part of the body modification subculture's myth-making. But once the name stuck, It really stuck. The association with royalty gave the piercing an ironic elegance. You could walk into a tattoo parlor and ask for a piece of Victorian fashion history, though perhaps not the kind that would have been discussed over tea at Balmoral. Despite the myth's shaky foundations, it's become part of the unofficial royal folklore. A blend of Victorian prudery, anatomical absurdity, and the public's unrelenting fascination with turning monarchs into meme fuel. Prince Albert himself, meanwhile, was a man of culture and restraint, a patron of the arts, a builder of museums, a man who revolutionized Britain's image through education and architecture. But will he be remembered for all that? Or for a steel ring and an urban legend that refuses to be zipped away? And speaking of things Victorian monarchs definitely disapproved of, let's dive into a king who hated smoking so much he basically invented the anti-vape rant. 33. James Y. and the counterblast to tobacco. Long before government health warnings, before surgeon generals, and centuries before cigarette packs showed graphic images, one British monarch stood on his soapbox and said, "Absolutely not." King James I hated tobacco with a passion that burned brighter than any pipe, and in 1604 he made it official, publishing a fiery little pamphlet with a glorious title, A Counterblast to Tobacco. It's not subtle. James rails against the noxious weed, calling it a custom loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, dangerous to the lungs. He goes on to describe the act of smoking as a branch of the sin of drunkenness, comparing it to a barbaric, devilish ritual. In other words, not a fan. Keep in mind, this was during the rise of tobacco as a fashionable import. Brought over from the Americas, it was all the rage in Europe. Courtiers puffed away in social settings. Merchants made fortunes. Poets romanticized the plume. James, unimpressed, wanted nothing to do with it. His pamphlet wasn't just personal, it was political. He raised taxes on tobacco imports, restricted its sale, and tried to curb its popularity through sheer rhetorical force. What makes it all the more fascinating is that this monarch, so often remembered for commissioning the King James Bible, also moonlighted as an early anti-smoking crusader. His counterblast reads like a 17th century TED Talk given by a monarch in full-on dad mode. Of course, his anti-tobacco stance didn't stop the plant's rise in Britain, but it cemented James I as one of history's earliest public health commentators, accidentally laying the groundwork for centuries of anti-smoking rhetoric. And if you think that's intense, just wait. James's next literary adventure? A full-on academic study of witchcraft. Royal hobbies, it turns out, can get very dark. 34. James Y. and demonology. If you thought King James IV had strong opinions about tobacco, just wait until he starts talking about witches. In 1597, nearly a decade before he became King of England, James published Demonology, a full-on philosophical, theological, and moral treatise on witchcraft. Written in dialogue form, it wasn't a vague warning or a casual essay. It was a scholarly endorsement of hunting witches, packed with classical references, scriptural citations, and chilling logic. The message? Witchcraft is real, and it must be stamped out. James wasn't writing in a vacuum. The late 16th century was Europe's witch-hunting peak, and Scotland was no exception. James himself had become obsessed with the subject after a stormy sea voyage in 1590, which he believed was conjured by witches attempting to harm him and his bride, Anne of Denmark. This led to the infamous North Berwick witch trials, one of the first large-scale witch hunts in Scotland. Demonology provided a royal seal of approval to all that fear. It laid out categories of demons, explained how witches made pacts with the devil, and justified torture as a means of extracting confessions. It wasn't just spooky bedtime reading, it was a license for paranoia. What's more, This book likely influenced a certain playwright by the name of William Shakespeare. Macbeth, with its infamous trio of witches and themes of supernatural manipulation, was written just a few years later, during James's reign. Coincidence? Highly unlikely. James saw himself as a scholar king, defending Christianity against dark forces. But in reality, demonology fueled witch trials across Britain, embedding suspicion into the legal system and the public imagination. So yes, he translated the Bible, but he also wrote the original Witch Hunting for Dummies. And while he was chasing sorcery, another monarch was making waves for a radical idea: bathing, once a month. 35. Elizabeth I and the once-a-month bath. Cleanliness may be next to godliness, but in the 16th century, it was more of an occasional flirtation. That's what makes Elizabeth I's monthly bath routine so progressive. Yes, you read that correctly. Queen Elizabeth I reportedly took a full bath once a month, whether she needed it or not. And in her time, that was nothing short of revolutionary. In an era when most people avoided full immersion for fear of disease, or simply didn't have the facilities, Elizabeth was sudsing it up like a Tudor trendsetter. Her bathroom at Richmond Palace was fitted with a luxurious wooden bathtub, lined with cloth and filled with warm water. Heated stones were used to maintain the temperature, and rose petals or herbs were often added for scent. Think less spa day, more royal ritual with the faint whiff of thyme. But it wasn't just about hygiene. For Elizabeth, her appearance was a matter of statecraft. Her famously pale complexion and carefully maintained wardrobe required constant upkeep, and cleanliness, by the standards of her day, was part of her mystique. The Virgin Queen needed to look immaculate, unchanging, and untouchable. So while others rubbed themselves down with vinegar-soaked cloths, Elizabeth got in the tub. Still, even with her monthly bathing schedule, she powdered her face with lead-based makeup, wore wigs, and layered on perfumes to mask any less than royal odors. Let's not pretend it was all lavender and loofahs. Her hygiene habits became part of her legend. Refined, meticulous, ahead of her time. Even if she was only marginally cleaner than everyone else, it was enough to make her stand out. And speaking of royal objects that have been around since Elizabeth's day, there's a certain ancient chair that carries kings to the crown, and it's not just any seat. 36. The coronation chair and the stone of scone. Every British monarch since 1308 has been crowned while sitting in the same chair. Yes, the same chair. Carved oak, worn smooth by centuries of royal rears, and infused with more symbolic weight than any throne on earth. It's called the coronation chair, and it's not just a place to sit, it's a national relic. Built for Edward I to house the Stone of Scone, also known as the Stone of Destiny, the chair was part of a larger plan to cement English dominance over Scotland. Edward had seized the stone, a sacred symbol of Scottish kingship, in 1296, and had it embedded in the chair's base. Literally and symbolically, future English monarchs would be crowned above Scotland's ancient heart. The chair itself is austere by royal standards. No velvet, no gold leaf, just straight, solid Gothic lines. But that simplicity hides its power. It has survived wars, reforms, and one of the boldest student heists in modern history. In 1950, a group of Scottish nationalists broke into Westminster Abbey and stole the Stone of Scone, transporting it back across the border in a rickety Ford Anglia. It was later recovered, well, most of it, and eventually returned to Scotland, where it's now displayed at Edinburgh Castle. But for coronations, it makes the trip back to London, where it reunites with the chair. At Charles III's coronation, the chair made another appearance. Cracked, graffitied, yes, 18th century schoolboys carved their names into it, and visibly aged. But still sacred, because for all its plainness, that chair represents continuity. A bridge from medieval monarchs to modern ones. An object that has seen rebellions, rebrands, and rituals, all from the best seat in the house. And speaking of rebellions, the next tale features disguises, deception, and a man bold enough to steal the crown jewels. Almost. 37. Colonel Blood and the Great Crown Jewels Heist. You've heard of cat burglars, but have you heard of clerical burglars? Meet Colonel Thomas Blood, the Irish adventurer who attempted one of the boldest heists in British history, stealing the crown jewels in broad daylight. Not from some poorly guarded castle in the countryside, but from the Tower of London itself. The year was 1671. Charles II was king. The monarchy had just survived civil war and restoration, and the Tower, ever the symbol of royal might, held the crown jewels under lock and key, watched over by a single keeper named Talbot Edwards. It all seemed secure, until Blood strolled in, dressed as a clergyman. Over several weeks, Blood visited the tower in disguise, charming Edwards and his family. He even introduced a nephew, actually an accomplice, to Edwards's daughter under the pretense of matchmaking. The plan worked. The family let down their guard. On May 9th, Blood returned with his crew. Once inside, they overpowered Edwards, knocked him out, and went for the loot. One man hid the orb in his trousers. Another flattened the state crown with a mallet to make it more portable. They were minutes from escape when Edwards regained consciousness and raised the alarm. Chaos erupted. Blood was captured near the drawbridge. But the story doesn't end there. In one of history's strangest turns, King Charles II not only pardoned Blood, but granted him land in Ireland and a royal pension. Why? No one knows for sure. Some say the king admired Blood's audacity. Others suspect espionage or blackmail. Regardless, the heist became legend. The crown jewels were remade, security tightened, and Blood became a folk anti-hero, a man who nearly stole the very symbols of monarchy from under their noses. And speaking of Charles II, let's not forget his other obsession, healing his subjects, with just a touch. 38. Charles II and the healing touch. Long before modern medicine, kings didn't just rule, they healed. At the heart of this mystical power was the royal touch, a centuries-old ritual where monarchs laid hands on subjects suffering from scrofula, a disfiguring illness known as the king's evil. The idea was that the divine right of kings came with divine power, literal healing coursing through royal fingertips. Charles II was the undisputed heavyweight of this practice. After the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, Charles leaned into the pageantry of kingship hard, and nothing was more theatrical than the touch. He didn't just dabble in it, he industrialized it. Records suggest that over his reign, Charles touched more than 90,000 people. That's not a typo, 90,000. The ceremony had all the trappings of royal drama, prayers, Latin chants, and golden touch pieces handed out to the afflicted, medallions worn like charms. People traveled from all corners of the kingdom for their chance at a royal cure, queuing for hours, even days, to be touched by the king's hand. Of course, the medical efficacy was questionable, but that wasn't really the point. The ritual reinforced the monarchy's divine mandate. In a world with limited science and even fewer cures, hope was as powerful as any medicine. By the 18th century, the Enlightenment and advances in medicine made the practice seem quaint, if not delusional. George I dropped it altogether, ushering in a more secular, rational image of the crown. But in Charles II's time, the royal touch was a spectacle of faith, tradition, and political theater, a blend of miracle and monarchy. And while healing may have been symbolic, the next royal obsession was unmistakably edible, though you wouldn't want to eat it. Not yet, anyway. 39. Pineapple houses and royal fruit fetishes. In the 18th century, the ultimate status symbol wasn't a carriage or a title. It was a pineapple. Yes, the prickly, tropical fruit from across the ocean became the most coveted item in Britain's elite circles. And the royals? Naturally, they led the charge. Pineapples were so rare and expensive, costing the equivalent of thousands of pounds today, that they were often rented rather than eaten. Guests admired them, hosts bragged about them, but biting into one, that was for the truly extravagant. Enter the royal gardeners. Determined to grow the spiky delicacy on home soil, the crown funded elaborate pineapple pits at royal estates. These weren't casual greenhouse projects. They were meticulously constructed with layers of manure-heated soil, angled glass, and a full-time staff dedicated to coaxing pineapples into existence in a completely inappropriate climate. The fruit became a symbol of hospitality, luxury, and colonial dominance. They were painted into portraits, carved into gates and bedposts, and displayed like trophies at royal feasts. King Charles II was even famously painted accepting a pineapple from his gardener, an image so staged it might as well be a Georgian Instagram post. Owning, or even borrowing, a pineapple signaled taste, wealth, and access to imperial imports. And while the rest of the country dreamed of a slice, the monarchy turned the fruit into a full-blown lifestyle brand. Eventually, as trade expanded and pineapples became more common, their social value dipped. But for a golden moment, one fruit ruled them all. And if you think fruit envy is intense, wait until you see what one king insisted on dragging everywhere just to take a proper bath. 40. Edward VII and his traveling bathtub. Royalty doesn't travel light, and Edward VII proved that with bubbles. Known for his love of luxury and personal comfort, Edward VII had many indulgences, but one of the most charmingly absurd was his insistence on bringing his own bathtub aboard the royal train. Yes, not just a towel, not a toiletry kit, an entire bathtub. Made of porcelain and brass, this portable spa on wheels followed him everywhere he went. Why the obsession? Simple. Edward had standards. And in the early 20th century, many estates, lodgings, and train compartments didn't meet his expectations for cleanliness or comfort. So he made his own arrangements, specifically a railway carriage modified to include a full-size tub, complete with hot and cold running water. This custom carriage became a staple of royal travel. It wasn't just about bathing, though. The royal train was an extension of Edward's identity. It was outfitted like a five-star hotel suite, with plush furnishings, fine wines, and enough food to host a mobile banquet. He enjoyed fine cigars, impeccable tailoring, and long, luxurious baths, ideally followed by gourmet meals and lively conversation. While some monarchs leaned into austerity or tradition, Edward embraced indulgence, and the bathtub was the perfect symbol of that. It turned an ordinary necessity into a mobile ritual of opulence. His love of personal comfort set the tone for a new kind of monarchy, less divine mystery, more worldly charm. He wasn't just a king, he was a lifestyle icon. And speaking of personal style, his queen had her own iconic accessory, not for fashion's sake, but for something she never talked about. 41. Queen Alexandra and the Choker. Trend. Long before fashion bloggers and red carpet reviews, Queen Alexandra was setting trends from her royal perch. And perhaps her most iconic, and most mysterious, was her unwavering devotion to chokers. Alexandra, wife of Edward VII, wore them constantly. Thick velvet bands, layered pearls, diamond-studded collars, you name it, she rocked it. Her chokers became so synonymous with her public image that women across Europe copied the style. Neckwear sales soared. Fashion houses took note. Alexandra wasn't just consort to the king, she was queen of the catwalk. But beneath the elegance lay a persistent rumor that Alexandra wore chokers to conceal a scar on her neck. The nature of the scar? Unknown. Possibly from a childhood illness. Possibly something else entirely. She never confirmed it, and royal protocol made sure no one ever asked. Instead, Alexandra turned a possible insecurity into a style empire. Rather than hiding the scar with subtlety, she leaned in and made it iconic. It's royal judo, flipping a flaw into a fashion statement so well that it becomes the trend. Her influence didn't stop there. Alexandra was beloved for her style, grace, and public poise. She brought Danish charm to the stiff upper lip of the British court. And while her personal life was marked by tragedies, including her husband's many affairs, she remained a beloved figure for her dignity and elegance. To this day, the choker carries echoes of her legacy, regal, mysterious, and quietly defiant. And while Alexandra was draping pearls around her neck, another king was peering through telescopes, mapping the stars, and funding a future far beyond coronets and coronations. 42. George III and his royal stargazing. Before he was caricatured as the Mad King, George III was a science nerd. Yes, the same monarch Americans love to lampoon for losing the colonies was, in his own realm, a major patron of astronomy. George III funded scientific research, corresponded with leading thinkers of the Enlightenment, and even had his own observatory built at Kew. The goal? To help Britain map the heavens and claim bragging rights over celestial discovery. One of his smartest investments was in William Herschel, the German-born astronomer who discovered Uranus, no giggling, in 1781. George was so impressed he gave Herschel a royal pension and appointed him King's Astronomer. Herschel's sister, Caroline, also received royal support, making her one of the first women in science to get paid for it. George didn't stop there. He financed new telescopes, supported planetary mapping, and promoted the use of astronomy in navigation and maritime power. For a king associated with losing ground on Earth, he was surprisingly focused on the stars. His observatory at Kew became a hub for scientific study. It wasn't just decorative, it housed cutting-edge instruments and was used for real research. George's involvement wasn't symbolic either. He studied the sky himself, kept up with scientific correspondence, and surrounded himself with thinkers rather than just flatterers. It's easy to reduce George III to the footnotes of revolution and madness. But before illness clouded his mind, he was a deeply curious monarch who saw science not as a threat to monarchy, but as its proudest expression. Because what's more regal than owning the sky? And speaking of kings facing decline, the next chapter in George's story involves not telescopes, but trees, and the legend of a sovereign speaking to them, sort of. 43. George III and the myth of talking to trees. When history paints monarchs, it often uses broad strokes, and for George III, one brushstroke has lingered unfairly for centuries, the idea that he talked to trees. It's an image that's become shorthand for royal madness, a lonely king wandering palace grounds, conversing with oak and elm as if they were courtiers. But like many tales that survive the memification of history, it's more myth than fact. Yes, George III suffered from severe bouts of mental illness. Modern historians believe he may have had porphyria, a rare genetic disorder that can affect the nervous system. His episodes were distressing, well documented, and, because he was the king, public knowledge. But the tree talking? That appears to be an exaggeration, born of political satire and Victorian dramatization. What is true is that George had a deep love for nature and farming. He earned the nickname Farmer George for a reason. He championed agricultural improvements, studied crop yields, and was genuinely fascinated by rural life. He frequently visited his estates, spoke with farmers, and supported innovations in land management. So, yes, he likely did talk near trees, perhaps even about trees. But not to them, not in the way the myth suggests. Unfortunately, the timing of his illness, paired with the loss of the American colonies, made George III an easy target for ridicule. Political cartoons were ruthless, And as the king's condition worsened, fiction and reality blurred. But the truth is more nuanced. George III was a devoted father, a scholar of science and agriculture, and a man trying to navigate both crown and crisis. And speaking of struggling with health and power, the next monarch wasn't just weighed down by responsibility, but by sheer physical mass. Let's ride up Whitehall with Henry VIII in a chairlift. 44. Henry VIII and his royal stairlift. By the end of his reign, Henry VIII wasn't charging into battle. He was being hoisted between floors. In his younger years, Henry was the athletic golden boy of the Tudor court, tall, dashing, obsessed with hunting, jousting, and showing off. But by the 1540s, years of injuries, overindulgence, and disease had taken their toll. The once sporty king had become a physically struggling monarch who needed help moving, literally. At Whitehall Palace, the largest royal residence of the time, Henry reportedly had a custom-built chairlift installed to move him between floors. This early version of a stairlift wasn't motorized. Servants would operate a pulley system to carry the king up and down a specially constructed staircase. It was practical, yes, but also a striking symbol of how the mighty had, quite literally, been brought low. Henry's size, rumored to be over 300 pounds near the end of his life, made movement difficult. He suffered from leg ulcers and required specially reinforced furniture. Massive thrones, wide beds, and of course, this mechanical lift. It wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity. But in typical Tudor fashion, even this adaptation was wrapped in grandeur. The chair was likely upholstered, the mechanics hidden behind paneling, the whole apparatus disguised so as not to tarnish the image of royal strength. It's a strange and slightly tragic detail. A king who once strutted through tournaments, now hauled by rope and manpower. Yet even at his weakest, Henry remained commanding, feared, obeyed, and endlessly iconic. And speaking of iconic exits, no wife of Henry's got a better deal than the one who wasn't loved, wasn't loathed, but outlived them all. But 45. Anne of Cleves, the queen who dodged a bullet. Anne of Cleves may not have won Henry VIII's heart, but she definitely won history's jackpot. Married to the famously fickle king in 1540, Anne was wife number 4, and she arrived in England having never met her husband in person. Her marriage was arranged for political alliance, and Henry, famously shallow and impulsive, was reportedly disappointed by her appearance upon first meeting. He claimed he was misled by her portrait, painted by Hans Holbein, and referred to her unflatteringly in private. The marriage lasted just 6 months. It was never consummated, and Henry sought an annulment, citing non-attraction and mutual disinterest. Anne, displaying some of the sharpest political instincts in Tudor court history, agreed without fuss. Her reward? A generous settlement, 2 royal houses, an allowance, and the lifelong title of the king's beloved sister. She remained close to the royal family, maintained her social status, and was regularly invited to court events. She didn't just survive, she thrived. Anne outlived all of Henry's other wives. She kept her head, her wealth, and her freedom, a rare trifecta in Tudor England. She never remarried, possibly by choice, and lived a peaceful life in the English countryside, dabbling in court life but avoiding its lethal intrigues. Her story is often overshadowed by Henry's more dramatic marriages. But in terms of happy endings, Anne of Cleves is the quiet winner of the Tudor Game of Thrones. She played it smart, she played it safe, and she walked away with her life and her fortune intact. Next up, though, we turn to royal companions of the four-legged kind. Because while kings may fall and queens may rise, one thing remains constant: corgis. Lots and lots of corgis. 46. The Queen's legendary corgis. If there's one animal that's become synonymous with the British monarchy, besides the lion on the royal crest, it's the corgi. Specifically, the Pembroke Welsh corgi. and no one cemented that connection more than Queen Elizabeth II. Her love affair with the breed began in 1933 when her father, the future King George VI, brought home a corgi named Dookie. From then on, the stubby-legged, sharp-eared dogs became a fixture in royal life. But it was Elizabeth who took it to the next level. Throughout her reign, the Queen owned more than 30 corgis. At one point, they had their own dedicated room in Buckingham Palace, complete with miniature wicker beds, gourmet meals prepared by palace chefs, and a rotating staff of footmen tasked with their care. These were not just pets. They were an entourage. The Queen's favorite, Susan, was even smuggled along on her honeymoon in 1947, tucked into the royal carriage under a rug. Many of Elizabeth's later dogs were direct descendants of Susan, making the royal corgi line as well established as the Windsors themselves. The corgis were known for their spirited personalities, loyal, yappy, occasionally bitey. In fact, palace staff were reportedly nipped more than once. But the Queen adored them. They followed her from room to room, trailed her through the palace gardens, and were often seen nestled around her feet during official engagements or state photo shoots. They weren't just symbols of royal warmth, they were part of her personal identity. Even in her final years, Elizabeth's last pair of corgis remained close by, present even at her funeral procession. And while her dogs yapped through halls and gardens, the Queen herself spoke volumes with something far more discreet: her handbag. 47. The Queen's secret handbag signals. Queen Elizabeth II was famously private, fiercely composed, and almost never gave away her feelings in public. But those in the know understood one secret language she used with near military precision: the handbag code. Yes, the Queen's purse, always elegantly perched on her arm, was more than just a place for lipstick and mints. It was a silent communication tool, a royal Morse code for her aides. Here's how it worked. If Her Majesty shifted her handbag from one hand to the other during a conversation, it meant she was ready to move on. If she placed it on the table during a formal dinner, it was a 5-minute warning that she wanted to wrap things up. And if she placed it on the floor? That was the diplomatic SOS. Get me out of here now. The Queen never raised her voice or made a scene. She didn't have to. Her staff were trained to interpret these signals and intervene accordingly, stepping in with a polite interruption, redirecting a conversation, or engineering a graceful exit. The bag itself was always the same classic Launer brand, simple and elegant, with a few models rotated in royal circulation. What was inside was famously mysterious, but reportedly included a mirror, reading glasses, a fountain pen, a compact, and sometimes even a crossword puzzle clipped from the racing post. The handbag wasn't just accessory, it was command central, a symbol of grace and control. And in a monarchy built on ritual, even the subtlest flick of the wrist could be part of a much larger performance. But not every royal lived life with such restraint. The Queen's sister, Margaret, took a wildly different approach. Famous for her late mornings, long cigarettes, and royal declarations that always came with a splash of gin. 48. Princess Margaret and the Art of Leisure. Where Queen Elizabeth II was duty-bound and reserved, Princess Margaret, her younger sister, was all fireworks, drama, and unapologetic flair. Margaret lived like she'd been handed the crown jewels and told to throw a party with them. Her mornings began around noon. Her breakfast? Orange juice, toast, and, reportedly, a steady stream of cigarettes and vodka. She was known for holding court late into the night, chain-smoking through conversations about art, politics, and her infamous social circle. A magnet for artists, actors, and jet-setters, Margaret was part royal, part bohemian icon. She vacationed with Mick Jagger, hobnobbed with Peter Sellers, and kept her Mayfair residence buzzing with London's cultural elite, and yet she still maintained her royal presence, with a touch of steel. Her relationships, especially with photographer Anthony Armstrong Jones, later Lord Snowdon, were tabloid gold. Theirs was the first royal wedding to be broadcast on television, watched by over 300 million people worldwide. But the marriage eventually unraveled, filled with infidelity, scandal, and very public fallouts. Margaret's lifestyle drew criticism, but she didn't seem to care. She was deeply complex, fiercely intelligent, often insecure, relentlessly stylish, and loyal to a fault. Her fashion choices were bold, her opinions sharper than any brooch pin, and her defiance of convention almost legendary. Yet behind the glitz and the tabloid glare was a woman who couldn't escape her position, always close to the throne, never destined to sit on it. It left her with power, but no clear purpose. So she carved her own, one of art, fire, and royal rebellion. And speaking of rebellious quips, the next royal wasn't known for parties, but for coining a word that perfectly captured what happens when you speak before thinking, and then do it again. 49. Prince Philip and the Science of Foot and Mouth. Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh and consort to Queen Elizabeth II for over 7 decades, was many things: a naval officer, a conservationist, a reformer of the royal household, and the unofficial king of unfiltered comments. In fact, he once coined a word to describe his own most infamous skill: dontopedology. He defined it as the science of opening your mouth and putting your foot in it. It was a rare moment of royal self-awareness, delivered with the dry, sarcastic charm that made Philip both beloved and occasionally eyebrow-raising. Throughout his public life, Prince Philip made headlines for comments that were equal parts outrageous and hilarious, depending on your perspective. He had a penchant for speaking his mind, often in situations that called for delicate diplomacy. From awkward jokes with foreign dignitaries to blunt observations about modern technology or British society, his remarks were unfiltered in the way only a royal with job security could afford. But behind the one-liners was a deeply committed royal. He modernized palace operations, supported more than 800 charities, and created the Duke of Edinburgh's award scheme, a youth development program that has impacted millions worldwide. He was also a passionate advocate for science, conservation, and interfaith dialogue. Philip's dontopedology was never mean-spirited, just, at times, wildly out of sync with the moment. But that honesty endeared him to many. He was the rare royal who felt utterly unscripted, a presence that grounded the institution even as he poked fun at it. And when he wasn't verbally juggling, he was busy doing something else entirely, like sketching, grilling, or racing carriages, like a 19th century thrill-seeker on a time machine. 50. Prince Philip. Jewels, BBQs, and carriage racing. Prince Philip's public persona was so often tied to his words that it's easy to forget just how multifaceted he was. The man had more hobbies than most people have excuses. Let's start with art. Philip painted watercolors and oils. Not just hobbyist doodles, but full-on landscapes, portraits, and studies. His work, while rarely exhibited, shows real skill and has been praised by professional artists. He also dabbled in jewelry design, creating pieces for Queen Elizabeth II, including a stunning bracelet made of diamonds and sapphires. Royal consort, meet artisan. Then there was the grill. Philip was a legendary barbecue enthusiast. At Balmoral, he took over outdoor cooking duties with serious pride, wielding tongs like a knight's sword. His custom-built BBQ setup was a royal marvel, practical, efficient, and perfectly tailored to his taste. Staff joked that he was never happier than when flipping steaks beside a smoky fire in the Scottish mist. And then there was carriage driving. When advancing age made polo a bit too rough, Philip took up carriage racing, because of course he did. The sport involves steering a lightweight carriage at high speeds through obstacle courses, pulled by powerful horses. It's not for the timid. Philip not only competed well into his 80s, but helped codify the rules and promote the sport internationally. He even wrote a book on it. These hobbies weren't about indulgence. They reflected a restless intellect and a refusal to slow down. Philip approached everything, whether designing a cufflink or navigating a slalom course, with the same razor-sharp focus. And speaking of passionate eccentricities, it's time to meet a monarch who doesn't just talk to plants, he listens to them. 51. King Charles III, talking to plants. Since before it was cool. Long before he became king, Charles was mocked, gently, usually, for admitting he talked to his plants. He wasn't joking. In a 1986 interview, then Prince Charles revealed that he regularly spoke to the flora at his Highgrove estate, believing it helped them grow. The British press, predictably, had a field day. But Charles stood his ground, explaining that it wasn't lunacy. It was connection, an understanding that plants, like people, thrive on attention and care. Decades later, science would catch up. Studies now suggest that plants can indeed respond to sound vibrations, and even show growth changes in response to human interaction. So Charles wasn't mad. He was early. Highgrove, his personal estate in Gloucestershire, became his botanical laboratory. Charles turned the grounds into a lush showcase of organic gardening, biodiversity, and sustainable design. He was composting before it was chic, pushing for eco-conscious architecture, while everyone else was still building concrete boxes. He championed heirloom varieties, beekeeping, and wildflower meadows. He eschewed synthetic fertilizers. And while others rolled their eyes, Charles planted seeds, literally and metaphorically, that would later bloom into serious green initiatives embraced worldwide. Beyond plants, Charles's environmental work spans decades. From climate change advocacy to founding the Prince's Trust to promoting urban sustainability, he has always been a monarch with a gardener's soul. His plant-whispering ways may have sparked ridicule at first, but in hindsight, they make sense. Talking to plants wasn't weird. It was on brand. Charles has always seen monarchy as stewardship. Of people, yes, but also of soil, air, and leaf. So next time you hear rustling in a garden, don't be surprised if it's a king, whispering sweet nothings to his nettles. And after all that greenery, it's time for something a little more spirited. Let's raise a glass to a queen with a favorite cocktail. 52. The Queen's Cocktail of Choice. Queen Elizabeth II was known for her discipline, decorum, and unwavering sense of duty. But she also knew how to enjoy the finer things, particularly when it came to her daily tipple. The royal favorite? A quietly iconic blend. Gin and Dubonnet, served with a slice of lemon and a couple of cubes of ice. Dubonnet is a French aperitif, slightly sweet, infused with herbs and quinine, and possessing an old-school sophistication. When mixed with gin in a roughly 2-1 ratio, Dubonnet to gin, it becomes a royal cocktail, refreshing, slightly bitter, and unmistakably 1950s in vibe. This wasn't a flashy drink. It didn't sparkle or come with a sugar rim. It was elegant, efficient, and quietly potent, much like the Queen herself. Though the exact frequency of her enjoyment remains wrapped in royal discretion, insiders and former staff often claimed she enjoyed the drink before lunch. Always at the right time, always in moderation, but always with the consistency of someone who knew her preferences down to the ounce. This cocktail wasn't just a habit, it was tradition. Both the Queen Mother and Princess Margaret were fans of Dubonnet, making it something of a royal staple. It even became a favorite among certain circles of the British public, who took delight in mirroring the monarch's preferred pour. The Queen's choice of drink offered a subtle peek into her personal taste, classic, understated, and a little nostalgic. In a world of ever-changing trends, her cocktail remained reliably old-fashioned, just like the institution she represented. And while the monarch's drink was light and sophisticated, the guardians of her ancestral fortress were beefier. Let's meet the tower's legendary guards and their meaty nickname. 53. Beefeaters, the tower's most loyal carnivores. Officially, They're known as the yeoman warders of Her Majesty's Royal Palace and Fortress, the Tower of London. But to everyone else, they're beefeaters. It's one of the oldest and most recognizable nicknames in Britain, and possibly one of the most literal. The name beefeater is said to have originated from the large meat rations they were traditionally given as part of their pay, specifically beef, which was both valuable and symbolic in royal circles. Whether they were actually consuming gargantuan piles of roast on a daily basis is still up for debate, but the name stuck. Established in the 15th century, the yeoman warders were originally tasked with guarding the Tower of London, which served as fortress, prison, and home to the crown jewels. Their duties were deadly serious. They protected kings and queens, kept an eye on high-profile prisoners, and enforced royal commands. They were elite veterans, loyal to the core. Today, beefeaters are ceremonial figures, but still require a serious resume. Every modern warder is a retired member of the armed forces with at least 22 years of service and an impeccable record. They lead tours, guard the tower's traditions, and perform the nightly ceremony of the keys, a ritual that's taken place every night without fail for over 700 years, even during bombings, pandemics, and wars. Clad in their iconic Tudor uniforms, they're part tour guide, part living museum exhibit. But don't mistake the pageantry for softness. They carry centuries of royal authority in every step. And while their name harks back to lavish meat privileges, it's not the only time royals used rules to manage appearance. Next up, a deep dive into monarchs who tried to legislate beards and bling. 54. Sumptuary laws. Royals versus beards and blouses. Royal control didn't end at taxes or treaties. It extended to your wardrobe. For centuries, English monarchs issued sumptuary laws, a series of regulations dictating who could wear what. These laws were designed to reinforce social hierarchies, maintain class boundaries, and, in many cases, curb public displays of excess. But sometimes they got oddly specific, like taxing your beard or limiting your sleeve width. Let's start with facial hair. Under Henry VIII, a beard was more than a statement. It was a taxable accessory. Men had to pay for the privilege of growing one, with the price varying by social rank. The beard tax wasn't just a revenue generator. It was a royal flex, turning fashion into a status marker. Clothing was policed even more aggressively. Only royals and high-ranking nobles could wear certain fabrics, like silk, velvet, or fur. Colors were also regulated. Purple? That was reserved for the upper crust. Ermine trim? Don't even think about it unless you were royalty or very high nobility. These laws weren't just about vanity, they were about power. In a society where appearance often was identity, regulating what people wore was a way to reinforce who was in and who was out. Sumptuary laws ensured that no merchant, however rich, could look like a duke. Your outfit became a walking declaration of your place in the world. The irony? Monarchs often broke their own rules when it suited them, and over time the laws fell out of fashion, literally and legally, as society became more fluid and fashion more rebellious. Still, the ghost of those laws lingers. British etiquette, royal dress codes, and ceremonial attire all carry echoes of that centuries-old obsession with appearance. And if you thought dress codes were strict, wait until you hear about a royal title that came with free booze, by the barrel. 55. The Poet Laureate and a Butt of Sack. Among the more curious perks in the royal orbit is the ancient, intoxicating tradition granted to the Poet Laureate, a title steeped in literary prestige and, historically, steeped in alcohol. The Poet Laureate is the official wordsmith of the crown, tasked with composing verse to mark significant royal occasions, coronations, jubilees, weddings, and, on occasion, less joyful events like royal passings. It's a position that dates back to the 17th century, first officially conferred on John Dryden by Charles II in 1668. But while the job may sound like it belongs in a dusty library, it came with one very spirited bonus: A butt of sack. Not a typo. A butt is a real unit of measurement, approximately 477 liters. And sack is an old term for dry sherry. So yes, the laureate received nearly 100 gallons of fortified wine as part of the gig. This liquid payment wasn't just ceremonial, it was delivered. Poets like Ben Jonson, Robert Southey, and Alfred Tennyson reportedly received their annual wine allowance, sometimes in literal barrels, sometimes converted into cash, depending on storage space or liver tolerance. While modern laureates, like Carol Ann Duffy and Simon Armitage, haven't necessarily continued the tradition in its original form, the legend of the butt of sack still hangs over the position like a very tipsy muse. It's a reminder that even royal patronage had its perks, especially if you were expected to rhyme about royal births and blessings on command. And while poetry and booze may have helped shape royal image, the real makeover began when Victoria picked her new royal address, a palace that would become synonymous with monarchy itself. 56. Buckingham Palace, Victoria's big move. Before it became the symbol of British royalty, Buckingham Palace was more suburban mansion than regal stronghold. But that all changed when Queen Victoria moved in and made it the official royal residence in 1837, the first monarch to do so. At the time, the palace wasn't exactly camera-ready. Construction had dragged on, the interiors were inconsistent, and the plumbing was, by all accounts, deeply unimpressive. But Victoria, newly crowned and determined to define a new era, embraced the palace as her headquarters and transformed it into the beating heart of the monarchy. She and Prince Albert set about upgrading the space, adding a new wing, the one with the now iconic balcony, expanding the gardens, and modernizing the royal apartments. They turned what had been a slightly awkward building into the central symbol of the crown. Buckingham Palace quickly became a stage for royal life. Public appearances, state banquets, and those all-important balcony moments. It was here that Victoria met her ministers, raised her children, and retreated in mourning after Albert's death. The building became more than just a residence. It became a canvas for the public narrative of monarchy. And it's still evolving. Today, Buckingham Palace contains over 775 rooms, including 19 staterooms, 52 royal and guest bedrooms, and 78 bathrooms. It has its own post office, doctor's office, cinema, and, of course, a ballroom that has its own acoustic secret. Because while most palaces echo with grandeur, Victoria's came with a gadget straight out of steampunk fantasy. 57. The ballroom's secret swinging panel. Victorian Britain was mad about invention, so when it came time to build a grand ballroom in Buckingham Palace, why settle for traditional acoustics when you could add a secret swinging panel? Hidden behind the ornate decor of the palace ballroom is a curious piece of Victorian gadgetry. A double panel designed to swing, yes, swing, slightly during performances to enhance sound distribution. The idea was that music should travel clearly to every corner of the room, no matter how many tiaras or epaulets were in the way. This wasn't a palace built on echoes. It was engineered like an instrument. The Victorians were obsessed with the intersection of art and science, and nowhere was that clearer than in royal architecture. The ballroom swinging panel is just one of many innovations hidden in plain sight, alongside secret doors, collapsible partitions, and mechanical stage lifts for pageantry and presentation. During balls, banquets, and state concerts, the ballroom was, and still is, the palace's theatrical heart. The panel ensured that every violin note and speech would carry, no matter where you stood. Guests might not have known why the acoustics were so perfect, but the royal architects did. Today, the panel remains, mostly unnoticed, part of the elaborate machinery of monarchy that blends tradition with subtle technical wizardry. And speaking of things hidden in plain sight, let's turn to royal portraits, where fruit, fur, and fluffy dogs weren't just decorations. They were coded symbols of power. 58. Hidden messages in royal portraits. Royal portraits aren't just paintings. They're puzzles in silk, jewels, and fruit. For centuries, British monarchs and their courtiers posed for official portraits that were more than just likenesses. These images were propaganda, coded with symbols meant to convey loyalty, power, purity, and wealth, without a single word spoken. Start with dogs. In royal art, a dog isn't just a cuddly companion. It represents loyalty. A spaniel curled at a queen's feet? That's not just cuteness. It's a visual statement of faithfulness, to spouse, to kingdom, to divine order. Ermine fur, often seen draped over royal shoulders, goes even deeper. In medieval legend, the ermine would rather die than dirty its pure white coat, making it a symbol of moral integrity and virtue. So when Elizabeth I wears ermine, she's not just warm, she's broadcasting her untouchable moral authority. Then there are the fruit and flowers. Oranges and pineapples were imported luxuries, visual shorthand for wealth, exotic trade, and imperial reach. Pineapples, in particular, were so rare in the 17th and 18th centuries that they were often painted more than eaten. Just having one in your portrait was a flex. Roses. A symbol of the Tudor dynasty. Oak leaves? Strength and endurance. And don't even get started on gloves or handkerchiefs. Those were status items too, showing off the delicate lace and fine embroidery only the rich could afford. These portraits were Instagram before Instagram. Everything meant something. Every fold, feather, and fruit had a function: to reinforce power, project piety, or suggest just the right amount of divine grace. And while the paintings sent silent messages, royals also had a long tradition of handing out something far more tactile: coins said to carry healing power in the palm of your hand. 59. Touch pieces. Royal healing in your pocket. Long before monarchs were waving from balconies, they were laying hands and coins on their subjects. The tradition of touch pieces dates back to the medieval practice of the royal touch, particularly for curing scrofula, or the king's evil. But it wasn't just the king's fingers doing the work. Monarchs often handed out small gold or silver coins, known as touch pieces, to the afflicted. These were no ordinary coins. They were talismans, physical tokens of the divine healing power said to flow through the royal bloodline. Typically bearing the image of St. Michael slaying the dragon, the coins were distributed during elaborate ceremonies where hundreds of sick people would line up to be touched by the sovereign. After the touch, each recipient received their coin, often strung on a ribbon to wear around the neck. It was part medicine, part souvenir, part political theater. Charles II, for example, was known to have touched over 90,000 people during his reign, and distributed touch pieces by the handful. The coins became so valuable to those who received them that they were often kept for life, passed down through generations, or buried with the owner. The practice faded as science rose. By the 18th century, Enlightenment thinking had cast doubt on the efficacy of divine healing, and George I officially ended the tradition. But the legacy lingered, both in folklore and in the collector's market, where original touch pieces are still prized artifacts. It's a fascinating collision of monarchy, medicine, and mysticism, where belief and symbolism were sometimes more powerful than penicillin. And speaking of belief, let's talk about a king who had a dozen children with his mistress, but none of them got a crown. 60. William IV, the king with 10 illegitimate kids. Before he became king, William IV lived a very unroyal life, more tavern than throne room, more common law than crown. Long before inheriting the crown at age 64, William spent over 20 years living with Irish actress Dorothea Jordan, his companion, partner, and mother of his 10 illegitimate children. Yes, 10. They weren't hidden away or scandalously erased from the record. In fact, they were given the surname Fitzclarence and grew up as part of a royal adjacent household. William and Dorothea's relationship was long, affectionate, and surprisingly domestic. They lived together in Bushy House, raised their children, and, for all intents and purposes, were a family, minus the formal royal blessing. Dorothea continued her acting career while William served in the Royal Navy and avoided most of the stiff protocols of palace life. But royalty demands sacrifice. As William aged and the line of succession grew urgent, he was pressured to make a proper marriage. In 1811, he separated from Dorothea and eventually married Princess Adelaide of Saxe-Meiningen. Dorothea was given a pension and custody of their daughters, but died in relative poverty a few years later. When William finally became king in 1830, none of his children with Dorothea could inherit the throne. British law made it clear. Only legitimate offspring counted in matters of succession. Still, William remained involved in their lives, granting them titles, securing advantageous marriages, and generally keeping them close. It's a chapter of royal history that feels surprisingly modern, a love story outside the bounds of protocol, a large, lively family that was unofficial, yet undeniably his. And as for William's successor, she was a teenage girl with a crown and a destiny, and more prime ministers to meet than any monarch before her. Starting with one when email wasn't even a dream. 61. Queen Elizabeth II, prime ministers, presidents, and a 1976 email. Queen Elizabeth II lived through a dizzying number of firsts, but she also became the longest reigning monarch in British history, giving her the unique distinction of meeting more prime ministers and U.S. presidents than most history textbooks can comfortably list. Let's start at 10 Downing Street. Over her 70-year reign, Elizabeth II worked with 15 British prime ministers, from Winston Churchill, who was born in 1874, to Liz Truss, whose premiership lasted only a few weeks in 2022. Her weekly audiences with prime ministers were legendary for their discretion. No notes, no recordings, just two people in a room, one with political power, the other with a lifetime of quiet institutional memory. She didn't offer orders, but she did offer experience. Elizabeth outlasted governments, party ideologies, and entire economic systems. Every prime minister, regardless of temperament or policy, had to make that weekly pilgrimage to the palace. And across the Atlantic? She met with 13 U.S. presidents, beginning with Harry Truman in 1951, when she was still a princess, and ending with Joe Biden in the final years of her reign. She rode horses with Ronald Reagan, sipped tea with the Kennedys, and navigated diplomatic dances with everyone from Eisenhower to Obama. But one of her quirkiest, most overlooked achievements? In 1976, during a visit to an army base, the Queen sent her first email. That's right, Elizabeth II was an early digital adopter, sending a message through ARPANET, the proto-internet. The subject line? Lost to time. But the moment signaled her quiet embrace of technology, well before smartphones or social media made it trendy. It's just one more sign of her understated genius. Never flashy, never trendy, but always ahead of the curve. And while she clicked send on history, another royal was clicking bike pedals and carving marble, long before princesses were expected to behave like athletes or artists. 62. Princess Louise, sculptor, cyclist, and Victorian rebel. Princess Louise, daughter of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, was not your average Victorian royal. In a world where princesses were expected to embroider, attend court balls, and marry quietly, Louise decided instead to wield a chisel, ride a bicycle, and speak her mind. Born in 1848, Louise grew up in a palace that valued intellect and creativity. But even within that environment, she stood out. She studied sculpture formally at the National Art Training School in London, now the Royal College of Art, becoming one of the first royals to attend public art school. Her work was no hobby. She completed large-scale commissions, including a bronze statue of Queen Victoria that still stands outside Kensington Palace. Louise also pushed boundaries socially. She associated with artists, intellectuals, and early feminists, people far outside the usual aristocratic bubble. She questioned stuffy court traditions and once described royal life as a prison. When it came to marriage, she stirred controversy again by wedding John Campbell, a commoner, though a noble one, who later became Governor-General of Canada. But perhaps her most charming rebellion was her love of cycling. In an era when it was considered scandalous for women to straddle a bicycle, Louise pedaled through parks and palaces with the wind in her veil. She embraced the freedom of movement, both physical and ideological, that cycling offered. Though not as well remembered as other royals, Louise left a unique legacy: artist, athlete, and advocate for women's independence in a tightly corseted age. And speaking of things preserved from the past, her father's beard took on a second life as a literal relic after his dramatic death. Let's just say, hair today, history tomorrow. 63. Charles vs. posthumous beard and royal relics. Most people lose their heads in metaphorical ways. Charles I lost his literally, and then became an icon. Executed in 1649 after a lengthy civil war and a trial for treason, Charles I's death marked the temporary end of the monarchy. But the reverence for him didn't die with his body. In fact, parts of him became relics, starting with his beard. Yes, you heard that right. A portion of Charles I's beard was reportedly preserved after his execution. Whether it was snipped by a loyal attendant or collected during later exhumations, because yes, his body was moved several times, strands of his facial hair were treated as relics, holy in a way. They were kept by monarchists and collectors, passed down like sacred artifacts of a martyred king. Charles had been viewed by many as a spiritual figure after his death, particularly by royalists who believed he died defending divine monarchy. He was canonized by the Church of England as King Charles the Martyr, and artifacts connected to him, his clothing, his books, even locks of his hair, became cherished objects. To this day, snippets of royal hair occasionally surface at auctions, tucked inside lockets or behind glass frames, testaments to a time when monarchs weren't just revered, they were nearly sanctified. And while Charles's beard may have lived on, the monarchy didn't. For over a decade, Britain became a republic, until his son, Charles II, swept back into London and reclaimed the crown. But when the monarchy returned, it needed structure, accounting, planning, and someone to balance the books. Enter the royally titled number cruncher whose job is far less dramatic but just as essential. 64. The keeper of the privy purse. In a world of golden coaches, priceless jewels, and palaces with 700 rooms, someone still has to ask, can we afford this? Enter the keeper of the privy purse, a real salaried job with a title straight out of a Monty Python sketch and responsibilities that are anything but comedic. This individual manages the monarch's personal finances, overseeing the sovereign's income from the Duchy of Lancaster, which funds the Queen's or King's official and private expenses, not covered by the sovereign grant, which itself comes from the government. Think of them as the royal CFO, except with centuries of protocol and the occasional diamond tiara involved. The position dates back to medieval times, when a privy purse was quite literally a private purse, a stash of gold coins the monarch could use without Parliament's permission. Over the centuries, it evolved into a professionalized role, handled by trusted accountants and courtiers. Today, the keeper doesn't just watch the royal wallet. They oversee budgeting for everything from travel and staff salaries to palace maintenance and ceremonial costs. They're also responsible for ensuring the monarchy appears financially responsible in the public eye. That means cutting costs where possible. Yes, even monarchies need to downsize, investing wisely, and issuing annual financial reports that are scrutinized by media and politicians alike. Despite the serious nature of the job, the title still raises eyebrows. It conjures images of someone literally guarding a velvet bag filled with gold coins, fending off pickpockets in the palace hallway. But in truth, it's one of the most important behind-the-scenes roles in the royal machine. And while the keeper manages the cash, the florists manage something far more sentimental, a flower tied to royal romance and buried in every bridal bouquet. 65. Myrtle in royal weddings and funerals. Among the grandeur of royal weddings, gilded coaches, designer gowns, cathedral choirs, there's one tiny detail that appears over and over again: a sprig of myrtle, quietly tucked into the bride's bouquet. This isn't just floral tradition, it's a living link to Queen Victoria herself. The practice began with Victoria's daughter, Princess Victoria, creatively named, who carried a sprig of myrtle from a plant grown from Queen Victoria's own wedding bouquet. That original bush was planted at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, and it's still growing today. Every royal bride since the 19th century has included a clipping from that same plant, symbolizing love, fertility, and fidelity. It's not flashy, it's not Instagrammable, but it's deeply meaningful. It turns a royal wedding, broadcast to millions, into something intimate and quietly rooted in family tradition. It connects each modern bride, from Princess Diana to Kate Middleton to Meghan Markle, back to the first truly modern royal couple. But it's not just weddings. Myrtle often appears in royal funerals as well, placed delicately among wreaths and floral arrangements. It's a soft continuity between beginnings and endings, joy and grief. A single botanical thread that runs through the most private and public moments of royal life. Even Queen Elizabeth II, known for her devotion to tradition, followed the custom. When her granddaughter-in-law Kate married Prince William in 2011, her bouquet featured that same Victorian myrtle, grown from the same plant, steeped in the same legacy. Some royal traditions are grand and gilded. This one fits in the palm of a hand and lasts for generations. And speaking of traditions that bloom at daybreak, the next royal custom involves a single piper, a castle window, and the most dramatic alarm clock in Britain. 66. The Royal Bagpiper Alarm Clock. Imagine waking up every weekday to the haunting wail of bagpipes drifting through the morning mist. That's not the setup for a Gothic novel. It's the real-life tradition of the royal piper. Every morning at 9 a.m., a lone piper plays beneath the monarch's window for exactly 15 minutes. This tradition began with Queen Victoria, who, after one visit to the Highlands, decided she couldn't live without the sound of pipes echoing across her morning tea. Since then, the role of piper to the sovereign has become one of the most unusual and enduring ceremonial posts in the royal household. The piper is a serving member of a Scottish or Irish regiment and lives alongside the royal family, traveling with them from palace to castle. Balmoral, Sandringham, Windsor, wherever the monarch goes, the pipes follow. The performance is always outside, rain or shine, and always precisely timed. There's no stage, no applause, just the lonely, majestic sound of history woven into each note. Queen Elizabeth II kept the tradition going for over 70 years, often describing it as one of her favorite daily rituals. Even while on royal tours abroad, she would sometimes request a local piper to continue the custom. It was a symbol not just of routine, but of continuity, a reminder that the monarchy, like the pipes, endures in both storm and sunshine. After her passing, King Charles III chose to continue the tradition, giving it yet another generational handoff. Because while palaces may modernize and protocols evolve, there's still something timeless about waking to the sound of pipes, echoing through stone corridors and ancient gardens. And while the monarch's day starts with a piper, one prince once started his day by landing a helicopter in the most unexpected of places. 67. Prince William's Helicopter Pub. Landing. It's not every day a prince drops into your local pub, literally. In 2011, while serving as a search and rescue pilot for the Royal Air Force, Prince William made an unexpected landing in the car park of the Bringwen pub in Anglesey, Wales. But this wasn't a case of royal thirst. William and his crew were responding to an emergency nearby. An injured teenager in need of urgent help. With time critical and terrain challenging, the pub car park turned out to be the safest available landing zone. Moments later, the future king stepped out of the helicopter in full flight gear, all business, coordinating the medical response. Once the teen was safely airlifted, William and his team were off again, leaving behind a very surprised pub crowd and one heck of a story. This wasn't a PR stunt. During his time with the RAF's 22 Squadron, William took part in numerous real-life missions, airlifting injured hikers, performing night rescues, and clocking hundreds of flight hours. It was part of his effort to live and serve like any other officer, blending his royal duties with genuine military commitment. The pub landing became local legend, a flash of monarchy meets real-world service. For a brief moment, the line between crown and commoner blurred. The prince wasn't waving from a balcony. He was boots on the ground, rotor blades whirring. And while William was touching down in a car park, another branch of royal tradition was standing very much still, guarding the monarchy with unflinching discipline and loaded weapons. 68. The King's Guard. Still, stern and seriously armed tourists may giggle, pose, or try to make them laugh. But the King's Guard is no joke. Stationed outside Buckingham Palace, St. James's Palace, and Windsor Castle, these soldiers in red tunics and bearskin hats are among the most iconic images of British royal tradition. But don't let the uniforms or ceremonial duties fool you. They're real soldiers, trained to the same rigorous standards as any member of the British Army. Yes, they will shout. And yes, their rifles are loaded. The King's Guard is drawn from active duty regiments, primarily from the Household Division, which includes elite units like the Grenadier Guards and Coldstream Guards. When they're not performing ceremonial duties, these soldiers serve in combat roles around the world. Tourists often test their resolve, trying to make them laugh, block their path, or sneak a selfie at uncomfortably close range. But the guards are trained to remain motionless, focused, and intensely aware of their surroundings. If someone crosses the line, they respond with a firm, practiced warning, a sharp stomp, a loud shout, or a very real threat of intervention. In short, don't mess with the bear skin. The iconic headgear itself is made from real fur and stands over a foot tall, designed originally to make soldiers appear taller and more imposing on the battlefield. It's heavy, hot, and deeply traditional, though calls for ethical alternatives have increased in recent years. So while the King's Guard may be part of Britain's photogenic charm, they're also a living link to centuries of military history. They represent loyalty, discipline, and strength. And if you're thinking of playing the fool around them, maybe think again. But not all royal duties are so rigid. Sometimes it's just about taking a stroll and shaking hands. A tradition popularized not by a king, but a queen. 69. The Royal Walkabout. Elizabeth II's revolutionary stroll. Today, it seems routine for a royal to step out from behind the velvet rope and shake hands with the public. But it wasn't always that way. The Royal Walkabout, the now familiar act of greeting crowds face to face, was introduced by none other than Queen Elizabeth II in the 1970s. And it changed royal engagements forever. Before that, royal appearances were largely ceremonial and distant. The public lined the streets, watched processions, and maybe caught a glimpse of a wave from a carriage. Royals didn't mingle. They appeared. But in 1970, during a tour of Australia and New Zealand, Elizabeth and Prince Philip broke tradition. Instead of waving from afar, they walked right into the crowd, shaking hands, smiling, and chatting with people who'd waited for hours. The gesture was revolutionary. Suddenly the monarchy felt more human, accessible, personal, and real. The walkabout became a standard part of royal life. Crowds now form outside events and appearances, specifically for the chance of a handshake or a kind word. It brought monarchy into the modern age, one palm at a time. Elizabeth mastered the art. She knew how to glide through a sea of admirers with warmth and grace, never missing a beat. She rarely spent more than a few seconds per person, but made each moment feel intentional. Her presence, up close, carried centuries of tradition with the intimacy of a neighborly visit. Today, the royal family continues the tradition. William and Kate, Harry and Meghan, and now Charles and Camilla all step beyond the velvet rope. But it was Elizabeth who set the tone, proving that sometimes the most radical change comes from simply stepping into the crowd. And speaking of royal waves, one Australian museum took the tradition very literally, with a mechanical joke that might just be monarchy's most delightful meme. 70. The Mechanical Waving Queen of Australia. In 2011, during Queen Elizabeth II's visit to Australia, her 16th and final trip down under, one museum paid tribute in a way that was equal parts affectionate and hilarious. They built a mechanical waving machine. No, seriously. Displayed at the Museum of Australian Democracy in Canberra, the device featured a gloved hand in white, mounted on a rod, slowly rotating up and down in the unmistakable motion of Her Majesty's iconic wave. It was encased in a glass box, dressed in classic Queen-esque attire, and labeled cheekily as a royal waver. With a motor that kept the hand in perpetual motion, the installation became an instant sensation. It wasn't mocking, it was deeply Australian. A nation known for its dry humor and irreverent affection had managed to capture the most famous royal gesture in history and distill it into pure kinetic art. The Queen was said to have taken it in stride, even enjoying the good-natured jab. After all, her wave had become something of a signature. Not too high, not too fast, just a gentle palm pivot that said everything from hello to nice to see you, without uttering a word. It was the wave of continuity, elegance, and restrained charisma. The royal waver machine now lives on in royal folklore, part quirky exhibit, part tribute, part performance art. It captured the world's fascination with even the smallest habits of the monarch and reminded us that even centuries-old traditions can be fun, human, and yes, a little bit silly. And if the waving machine captured the Queen's poise, the next royal fact dives into something a bit more portable. Let's open the clutch on the gin-soaked legend of the Queen Mum's favorite emergency accessory. 71. The Queen Mother and the handbag full of gin. The Queen Mother, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, was more than just the King's wife or the Queen's mum. She was the grand matriarch of the monarchy, known for her pastel dresses, serene smiles, and the kind of iron resilience that helped Britain through World War II. But underneath that lavender exterior, a twinkle in the eye, a dry wit, and a rumored love for a well-timed tipple. Legend has it that the Queen Mother never went anywhere without her trusty handbag, and nestled inside wasn't just a handkerchief or compact. No, the rumor mill insists that she kept a small bottle of gin tucked discreetly among her accessories. You know, just in case. Was it true? Royal sources remain coy, but the stories persist. Tales of mid-afternoon cocktails, emergency G&Ts before long car rides, and garden parties where the Queen Mum's cheerfulness had more than a hint of juniper behind it. One of the more delightful, and likely apocryphal stories claims she once quipped, "I couldn't get through my work without a little something." Her public image, however, remained unflappable. She embodied the British stiff upper lip and a deep-rooted sense of duty. During the Blitz, she stayed in London while Buckingham Palace was bombed. Her presence was a symbol of resolve. And yes, perhaps that resolve was occasionally fortified with gin. Whether the gin in a handbag story is gospel or gossip, it speaks to her legend, a woman of class, courage, and perfectly timed levity. And while the Queen Mum was famous for her humor, her daughter-in-law, Princess Diana, became famous for something much more refined, mastering the art of gratitude, one handwritten note at a time. 72. Princess Diana's legendary thank you notes. Among her many royal superpowers, style icon, humanitarian, cultural disruptor, Princess Diana had one more, deeply personal skill. She wrote thank you notes, lots of them, by hand. Often on the same day she received a gift or met someone for the first time. It might sound simple, but it was revolutionary in the world of modern monarchy. These weren't form letters or pre-printed cards. These were real, warm, sometimes even cheeky messages written in her loopy, unmistakable handwriting. Recipients included hospital patients, children, fashion designers, photographers, charity workers, and average members of the public who had sent her flowers or cards. Diana made people feel seen, not just on global stages or in the media spotlight, but in tiny private acts of recognition. One oft-repeated anecdote recalls how, after Prince William's 6th birthday, she sent dozens of thank you notes to everyone who had given him a present. Staff were stunned by the speed and sincerity with which she worked, personalizing each note with details from the gift or the encounter. Some of these notes have since surfaced at auction, revealing her charm and wit. Thank you for the furry toy. William's already taken it hostage. Or, thank you for the flowers. I'm surprised they survived the journey. The letters have become cherished artifacts, not because they're valuable, but because they were personal. They reflect a woman who understood the power of connection, even in a system not always known for its warmth. And in the end, that's part of Diana's enduring legacy, making the monarchy feel human. But centuries earlier, another royal made headlines not for thank you notes, but for losing the literal crown jewels. Where? In a swamp. Because of course he did. 73. King John and the Crown Jewels, lost to the sea. If you're wondering whether there's a more dramatically symbolic royal blunder than literally losing the crown jewels, meet King John, circa 1216. John, the infamous monarch behind the Magna Carta and villain of countless Robin Hood adaptations, managed to turn misfortune into legend when he lost the crown jewels in the Wash, a tidal estuary in eastern England. Yes, lost them, as in they vanished into the mud and were never recovered. Here's what happened. John was fleeing rebellious barons and the advancing French army during the First Barons' War. He was sick, desperate, and on the run, needing to cross the Wash, his baggage train, laden with royal treasures, silver, gold, and yes, the crown jewels, was sent ahead of him to ford the estuary at low tide. Unfortunately, they miscalculated the timing. The tide came in faster than expected, swamping the wagons and swallowing the royal loot into the marshy sands. The entire convoy sank. Horses, carts, and the glittering symbols of royal authority gone beneath the mud. The crown jewels of the time, not the current set used since Charles II, were never found, despite centuries of rumor, treasure hunters, and more than a few metal detectors. Within a week of this royal disaster, John himself died of illness. Some say it was dysentery, others say it was heartbreak or embarrassment. Whatever the cause, it was a low point in English royal history, a monarch defeated by his enemies and the tides. The event became a metaphor for John's chaotic, ill-fated reign, grasping at power, drowning in trouble, and ultimately undone by a lack of foresight and a lot of wet luggage. Speaking of ceremonies gone sideways, the next tradition is a lot more polished, thanks in part to a secret recipe, sacred oil, and a cruelty-free royal upgrade. 74. Coronation oil, from sacred secret to vegan formula. Among the many surreal moments in a British coronation, golden orbs, gem-crusted swords, choirs chanting in Latin, there is one element that holds deep spiritual weight: the anointing of the monarch with holy oil. This is not just for show. The act of anointing a sovereign with consecrated oil is one of the most sacred and private parts of the coronation ceremony. It symbolizes divine approval, an echo of biblical kings and queens, and marks the moment when the monarch is spiritually transformed. Traditionally, the oil was made from a closely guarded recipe including ingredients like ambergris, a whale byproduct, civet, from cat glands, and musk, from deer glands, which, as you might imagine, raises some modern ethical concerns. But when King Charles III was crowned in 2023, the oil underwent a major overhaul. His coronation featured a newly formulated oil that was 100% cruelty-free and plant-based, using olive oil as the base. It was pressed in Jerusalem and infused with fragrant elements like sesame, rose, jasmine, cinnamon, neroli, and orange blossom. In other words, the new monarch was anointed with something both sacred and sustainable. This update wasn't just about ethics. It reflected Charles's personal commitment to environmentalism and animal welfare, subtly embedding his values into the most ancient of rituals. Even something as timeless as coronation oil got a royal reboot. The anointing itself is still hidden from public view, shielded by a canopy or screen, protected from cameras and onlookers. It remains one of the few private moments in a ceremony otherwise shared with millions. And while that oil represents spiritual ownership, the monarchy also claims ownership of something far less sacred, a fast food joint. Yes, really. 75. The crown owns a McDonald's. Kind of. If you ever bite into a Big Mac near Oxford and feel a strange urge to curtsy, don't worry, it's not the fries talking. You may be eating on royal land. In one of the strangest modern intersections between monarchy and fast food, the Crown Estate owns the land upon which a McDonald's sits in Banbury Gate Shopping Park, Oxfordshire. The land isn't directly controlled by the royal family themselves. It's managed by the Crown Estate, a vast property portfolio valued in the tens of billions, with profits sent to the Treasury. But still, technically, it's the Queen's, now King's, McDonald's. This is not your average Golden Arches setup. The location in question has been described as one of the poshest McDonald's in the UK. We're talking leather seating, wooden paneling, ambient lighting, and even iPads on the tables. It's not quite, would you like caviar with that? But it's definitely a few rungs above your standard drive-thru. Of course, the royal family isn't flipping burgers or managing shift schedules. They don't get a free Happy Meal with every crown. But it's a fun, absurd reminder of just how far the monarchy's reach extends, even to places with 24-hour fries and milkshake machines that may or may not be working. The Crown Estate also includes Regent Street, large swaths of farmland, offshore wind farms, and a big chunk of the seabed around the UK. The fact that one of those parcels happens to host a McDonald's is simply a bonus for trivia lovers, and a weirdly fitting symbol of monarchy in the modern world. Tradition, property, and a side of fries. And speaking of royal real estate, many palaces are so big they need their own infrastructure, including one surprising royal amenity you'd expect in a small town, not a castle. 76. Palaces with post offices and police stations. Royal palaces aren't just lavish homes, they're operational microcities. And like any good city, they need infrastructure, security, communication, and logistics. Which is why several British royal residences, Windsor Castle included, have their own post offices and police stations. Yes, you read that right. A post office inside the palace. At Windsor Castle, there's a functioning Royal Mail facility that handles letters and parcels not just for the royal family, but for the staff who live and work on site. With hundreds of residents, from equerries and chefs to cleaning crews and guards, palace life generates more correspondence than you'd think. And the police? They're not ceremonial. The Metropolitan Police's Royalty and Specialist Protection Unit is responsible for guarding royal sites and family members. Inside royal grounds, full-time officers work dedicated beats. Windsor Castle has its own police station, fully equipped and staffed, ready to protect against threats, manage crowds, and handle everything from tourist misbehavior to actual security alerts. The combination of post offices and police stations makes royal estates feel like a strange blend of Downton Abbey and a municipal government. These aren't just heritage sites. They're working ecosystems, constantly moving behind the scenes, even when all the public sees is a stately facade. Buckingham Palace, for example, also has its own doctor's office, cinema, and ATM. The idea is simple. Keep operations internal, discreet, and highly secure. And when it comes to daily routine, few royal habits were as beloved, or as thoroughly color-coded, as the Queen's obsession with the racetrack. 77. The Queen's passion for racehorses. Queen Elizabeth II wasn't just the ceremonial head of state. She was also one of Britain's most successful and devoted racehorse breeders. Her love of horses wasn't just a charming side interest, it was a full-blown equestrian empire, meticulously managed and deeply personal. From a young age, Elizabeth was obsessed with horses. By the time she was crowned, she already had a stable of thoroughbreds and was diving into the sport with all the intensity of a true enthusiast. Over her lifetime, her horses won over 1,800 races. Her racing silks, purple body, gold braid, scarlet sleeves, were a fixture on tracks across the UK. The Queen didn't just own horses. She studied bloodlines, attended auctions, and personally reviewed veterinary reports. Trainers and jockeys spoke of her deep knowledge and hands-on involvement. It wasn't uncommon for her to call a stable to discuss an injury or strategy. She celebrated wins with genuine joy and took losses with quiet grace. Her favorite horses were treated like royalty themselves. Some were buried at special cemeteries in royal estates, with headstones and full honors. She even kept detailed handwritten notes about her horses in her private journals. At events like Royal Ascot, Elizabeth was in her element. While the public watched for fashion and glamour, she was watching the paddock like a seasoned bettor. In fact, her enthusiasm at Ascot was one of the few times she visibly broke the famous royal stoicism, clapping, cheering, even jumping to her feet. Her racing legacy continues through King Charles, though few expect him to match her dedication. Because for Elizabeth, horses weren't a hobby. They were a passion, a lifeline, and one of the few places where she could just be herself. And speaking of royal brands, some businesses still wear the Queen's stamp, literally on their packaging. 78. The Royal Warrant, by appointment to the Crown. Ever seen a box of Twinings tea, a bottle of Heinz ketchup, or a Barber jacket with the words, "By appointment to Her Majesty the Queen"? That's not just a marketing ploy. It's a real, centuries-old distinction called the Royal Warrant, and for British companies, it's one of the most coveted badges of honor. The Royal Warrant is a stamp of approval issued to companies that supply goods or services to the royal household. It's not handed out lightly. A business has to supply the monarchy consistently, usually for at least 5 years, before even being considered. If granted, the warrant allows them to display the royal coat of arms and the all-important phrase on their packaging, storefronts, and advertising. There are currently hundreds of royal warrant holders, from luxury brands like Fortnum & Mason and Hunter Boots, to more humble suppliers of soap, umbrellas, and dog food. What matters isn't flash. It's reliability, quality, and service to the crown. Each monarch, and some senior royals like the Prince of Wales, issue their own warrants. When a monarch dies, existing warrants tied to their name expire after a grace period and must be reissued by the new sovereign. So when Queen Elizabeth II passed in 2022, businesses had to await King Charles III's decisions on which warrants would carry forward. Royal warrants don't come with cash or contracts, but the prestige is priceless. They imply excellence, tradition, and a certain Britishness that's hard to manufacture. And while the warrant might appear on a teabag box, The monarchy's logistical planning extends to things much grander, like the royal train, which runs so quietly you might not even hear it arrive. 79. The royal train and its no-squeak policy. The royal train isn't just a symbol of stately travel. It's a rolling fortress of decorum, engineered for stealth, comfort, and the softest possible arrival. While it might not have the pizzazz of the royal carriage or the aerial drama of a helicopter flyover, the royal train plays a very specific role. Get the monarch where they need to be, on time, in comfort, and in near total silence. One of the quirkiest yet most telling features of this train? The no squeaks policy. Seriously, every door, latch, and fixture on the royal train must operate silently. Maintenance teams are assigned to check for and eliminate any squeaky hinges, rattling bolts, or noisy components. Why? Because when you're carrying the monarch, creaky compartments just won't do. It's not just about luxury, it's about dignity, predictability, and a little bit of old-school royal theater. The current royal train consists of a collection of specially outfitted carriages, each tailored to specific members of the royal family. Queen Elizabeth II had her own saloon, complete with a bedroom and a full-size bathtub, though she reportedly preferred showers. Prince Philip had a private study. There's even a dining car, where meals are served on linen-covered tables with silver cutlery and crystal glasses. Unlike the flashy, gold-trimmed vehicles of other royal ceremonies, the train is deliberately low-key in appearance. From the outside, it looks like a standard maroon locomotive, until you realize there are no logos or commercial identifiers. It travels mainly at night to minimize disruption and maximize security, rolling quietly from city to city like a well-oiled ghost. For royal watchers, catching a glimpse of the train is a rare treat. It's not public, it's not tourable, it just exists, part of the smooth, whispering machinery that keeps the monarchy moving. And speaking of weighty traditions, the next royal artifact may look like a gilded planet, but its clever design hides a surprisingly practical twist. 80. The hollow secret of the coronation orb. The coronation orb, a glittering golden sphere topped with a jeweled cross, representing the Christian world under the rule of God and monarch. It's one of the most instantly recognizable items in the crown jewels, held carefully by sovereigns during their coronation, as if cradling the weight of the world. But here's the twist. It's hollow. Despite its commanding appearance, the coronation orb is not a massive ball of solid gold, and thank goodness for that. Solid gold, at that size, would weigh around 20 pounds or more, a serious wrist workout and a potential hazard for any monarch tasked with standing through a multi-hour ceremony in heavy robes and regalia. Instead, the orb is made of gold-plated metal and designed to be manageable. Weighing just under 3 pounds, around 1.3 kilograms, it's still hefty, but nothing that requires a personal trainer. Created in 1661 for the coronation of Charles II, after the restoration of the monarchy, the orb is a replacement for an earlier medieval version destroyed during Oliver Cromwell's short-lived republic. The new orb had to be both visually spectacular and symbolically potent, and, crucially, usable by human hands. It's adorned with 9 emeralds, 18 rubies, 9 sapphires, 365 diamonds, and 375 pearls, all arranged in 3 bands representing the 3 continents known at the time of its design. It is placed in the monarch's right hand during the coronation service, then laid upon the altar as a symbol of submission to divine authority. The hollow design isn't a design flaw. It's a design masterstroke, balancing beauty with function. And it's proof that even the most ceremonial of royal objects have been shaped by very real, very practical considerations. But not all royal jewels are worn by kings. Some, like the Koh-i-Noor diamond, come with rules and a long, controversial history. 81. The Koh-i-Noor diamond, a jewel reserved for queens. The Koh-i-Noor diamond is one of the most famous and contentious gems in the world. At over 100 carats, with a history that spans empires, thrones, and wars, it's not just a rock, it's a lightning rod. Currently part of the crown jewels, the Koh-i-Noor sits in the crown of the late Queen Mother and has not been worn by a British king since it entered the royal collection in 1850. Why? Tradition and superstition dictate that the diamond is only worn by queens and queen consorts. The legend goes that every man who wears the Koh-i-Noor suffers misfortune. Its history, after all, is riddled with betrayal, conquest, and bloodshed. It passed through the hands of Indian, Persian, Afghan, and Sikh rulers before being surrendered to the British East India Company and presented to Queen Victoria. From there, it became part of the crown jewels, but with a ghostly asterisk attached. No British king has worn it since. Victoria placed it in a brooch, then later in a crown, worn by her and later queens. Even during the coronation of King Charles III, the Koh-i-Noor was notably not featured, likely to avoid stoking modern diplomatic tensions with countries like India, Pakistan, and Afghanistan, all of which have called for its return. The diamond, whose name means mountain of light in Persian, remains dazzling but controversial. It's a reminder that royal treasures are never just pretty objects. They carry the weight of history, conquest, and legacy. And while the Koh-i-Noor stays reserved for consorts, another royal had a far quieter obsession. Not with diamonds, but with stamps. Thousands of them. A collection fit for a king. And then some. 82. George V and the world's most royal stamp collection. When you think of royal hobbies, you might picture polo, fox hunting, or maybe some high society yachting. But King George V? He preferred something far more delicate and far more valuable. Stamps. Lots of them. George V, who reigned from 1910 to 1936, wasn't just a casual collector. He was a philatelic powerhouse, amassing what would become one of the most impressive stamp collections in the world. Today it's known as the Royal Philatelic Collection, and it contains hundreds of thousands of stamps, many of which are one of a kind. The king's obsession began in childhood, but fully bloomed in adulthood. He once reportedly outbid the entire German government for a prized stamp, spending a then scandalous £1,450, equivalent to tens of thousands today, on a single Mauritius post office issue. When someone questioned the cost, he allegedly replied, "I wish to have the best collection and not one of the best collections." He wasn't kidding. George V personally organized and annotated many of the stamp albums, writing in meticulous copperplate. He even built a special room in Buckingham Palace to house the growing archive, essentially a stamp sanctuary, guarded more heavily than some jewelry collections. Successors have preserved and expanded the collection, and it's now held in trust, managed by appointed curators. The Royal Philatelic Collection is so valuable, it doesn't tour without extreme security precautions. Some items are considered priceless. George V's stamp legacy proves that even monarchs can be nerds at heart, painstakingly flipping through albums, hunting for rare errors, and delighting in perforated edges. And speaking of royal delights, the next monarch on our list had a culinary crew so ambitious they once gilded peacocks, because plain old poultry just wasn't regal enough. 83. Henry VIII's Kitchen. Feasts for 600 and gilded birds. Henry VIII may be remembered for his wives, wars, and waistline, but he was also the undisputed king of royal feasting. And the numbers don't lie. His palace kitchens at Hampton Court could feed up to 600 people. Twice a day. This wasn't just dinner. This was a military operation disguised as a banquet. The kitchens stretched over 50 rooms, manned by 200 staff members working around the clock. Meat, fish, poultry, bread, pies, wine, and of course, Ale flowed like rivers through the stone corridors. Every meal was a performance of power and plenty. And then there were the peacocks. Yes, peacocks. Stuffed and roasted, then redressed in their own feathers and, in some cases, gilded with gold leaf. Because what says divine right of kings more than a shiny, reassembled bird? Gilding food was a visual flex. The gold wasn't meant to be eaten, it was meant to dazzle. When you walked into Henry's hall and saw a shimmering peacock surrounded by sugar sculptures and steaming venison, the message was clear. The king was rich, generous, and slightly terrifying. Meals were arranged in strict order of rank. The higher your status, the more courses and variety you received. The king himself dined separately in his private chamber on bespoke dishes prepared by the top chefs. Roasted swan? Sure. Whale blubber? Occasionally. Anything to stand out. Even the logistics were groundbreaking. Hampton Court had its own brewery, fish ponds, gardens, and slaughterhouses, an entire supply chain embedded in palace walls. Henry's appetite for food mirrored his appetite for grandeur, excessive, theatrical, and meticulously managed. And while his kitchens were a riot of meat and metal, the next royal obsession takes a sharp turn toward porcelain, a fragile addiction that took over entire rooms. 84. The royals' obsession with blue and white porcelain. If you thought modern royals had a penchant for tasteful interiors, wait until you hear about their porcelain addiction. In the 17th and 18th centuries, Britain's elite, and especially its queens, went absolutely bonkers for blue and white porcelain. We're talking obsessed to the point of architectural remodeling. Imported from China and later imitated in Delft in England, blue and white porcelain became a symbol of refinement, intellect, and status. It wasn't just about the tea sets. Entire rooms were designed around porcelain displays. Think floor-to-ceiling shelves crammed with vases, dishes, and ornamental jars, all perfectly color-coordinated. Queen Mary II, wife of William III, was particularly enthralled. Her apartments at Kensington Palace were practically tiled in porcelain. She commissioned carpenters to build special display niches into the wood paneling, ensuring her delicate treasures could be shown off at all times. The effect was striking. Shimmering blues and crisp whites gleaming against warm candlelight, a soft power move disguised as home decor. It wasn't just aesthetics. The craze also reflected early globalization. These were some of the first consumer goods that came directly from Asia to European households. Owning them meant you were cultured, connected, and rich enough to care about fragile things. Soon, royal households across Europe followed suit, amassing vast porcelain collections. Some were functional, some purely decorative, and all carefully arranged to impress visitors. The fascination eventually led to the founding of local porcelain factories like Wedgwood and Spode, an entire industry inspired by the royal urge to hoard blue and white beauty. The obsession eventually cooled, but the legacy remains. Even today, you'll spot nods to the classic royal porcelain aesthetic in state dining rooms and palace gift shops. And speaking of rooms where royal business gets done, sometimes those rooms weren't private at all. In fact, your most intimate moments could be a public spectacle. 85. The public bedchambers of British monarchs. Imagine waking up with a crowd of courtiers in your room, quietly observing your every move as you get dressed. Not paparazzi, official royal spectators. Welcome to the strange tradition of the public royal bedchamber. In the early modern era, particularly from the Tudors to the early Georgians, the monarch's bedroom wasn't a private retreat. It was the political stage. The royal lever, from the French lever du roi, or the king's rising, and coucher ceremonies involved nobles, favorites, and selected guests witnessing the sovereign's morning routine, dressing, grooming, even the occasional prayer or whispered counsel. This wasn't voyeurism, it was hierarchy in motion. Proximity to the royal body meant power. If you were invited into the bedchamber, even just to hold a sleeve or pass a shoe, It signaled your favored status at court. Imagine the scramble, courtiers jostling for the chance to hand the king his wig. At Versailles, the Sun King Louis XIV perfected this spectacle. But the British monarchs had their own spin. Even as late as the early 1700s, Queen Anne's daily routines were witnessed by ladies-in-waiting and other courtiers. It was part ceremony, part social ladder, and part control mechanism. Eventually, of course, privacy won. By the time of Queen Victoria, bedrooms were once again personal spaces, used for rest, not political theater. But echoes of the old ritual survive in modern times, like the carefully staged royal Christmas photo or the Queen's speech, intimate moments made public in the name of tradition. So yes, once upon a time, even sleep had a spectator sport version in royal circles. And while public flattery reached its peak in the bedroom, the verbal version thrived in the corridors, where courtiers tried to outdo each other with sweet-tongued absurdity. 86. Elizabeth Thrush's Court and the Art of the Compliment. Elizabeth didn't just rule England, she ruled language. And her court? It was a battlefield of metaphors, similes, and sugar-coated flattery so elaborate it could make Shakespeare blush. Courtiers didn't just speak to the Queen, they performed. Every conversation was laced with poetic praise, carefully calibrated to charm, flatter, and, if they were lucky, win favor. The Queen was often referred to as the Virgin Goddess, Gloriana, or even the Star of the Sea. Standard compliments wouldn't cut it. If you weren't comparing her to the sun, the moon, or divine light itself, you weren't really trying. This wasn't just vanity. It was strategy. Elizabeth understood the power of language as both shield and sword. She encouraged the flattery, knowing full well that by elevating her into near-mythical status, she strengthened her political position. She even participated, answering flattery with clever turns of phrase or witty retorts, proving she was as sharp as any man in her court. One famous example? Sir Walter Raleigh once wrote that Elizabeth's eyes are like bright stars, to which she reportedly responded, "Then they must also see through your lies." Burn. The atmosphere created by this constant verbal jousting became known as Elizabethan courtly love, a sort of chivalric theater where everyone played a part and every sentence could double as a power move. This obsession with polished speech left a literary legacy too. It helped spark the English Renaissance, inspiring poets, playwrights, and philosophers to refine their craft. But behind the beautiful words was a very real system of control, flattery as currency, metaphor as maneuver. And when the flattery faded, and monarchs eventually passed, one strange countryside custom ensured even bees were informed of the sovereign's fate. 87. Telling the bees when the monarch dies. It sounds like folklore, and it is, but it's also real. When Queen Elizabeth II passed away in 2022, royal beekeepers followed an ancient tradition that stretches back centuries. They told the bees. On royal estates like Buckingham Palace and Clarence House, the head beekeeper draped the hives in black ribbon and solemnly informed the bees that their mistress had died. The phrasing varies, but it's often something like, "Your mistress is dead, but don't you go. Your new master will be good to you." This bizarre yet beautiful ritual harks back to rural English and Celtic customs, where bees were seen as deeply spiritual creatures, messengers between worlds. If you didn't inform them of a major life event, birth, marriage, or death, it was believed they might leave the hive or stop producing honey. The tradition isn't just for monarchs. In rural communities, families would once tap the hive and whisper news of weddings or funerals to the bees. Some would leave bits of cake or tie mourning cloths to the hives. Others sang to them. It was a way of acknowledging that these tiny creatures, so central to daily life, were part of the emotional fabric of the household. The royal version, of course, adds pomp. When Elizabeth II died, the hives were officially draped, and King Charles III was introduced to the colonies as their new master. It's one of those rituals that sounds too strange to be real, but it is. And it reflects something unexpectedly tender about the British monarchy. For all the opulence and ceremony, there's still space for quiet, symbolic gestures shared between humans and nature. And while bees may buzz in the gardens of power, another royal icon quietly hung beneath the Queen's table, keeping tradition tidy, one hook at a time. 88. The Queen's Handbag Hook. Royal practicality in miniature. Queen Elizabeth II's handbag was more than just a fashion accessory. It was a communications device, a subtle signal system, and occasionally a mobile toolkit. Among the many peculiar items rumored to be inside, mints, reading glasses, a crossword puzzle, there was one confirmed piece of gear that perfectly summed up the Queen's style: a portable handbag hook. Yes, a hook. A small, discreet metal arm designed to clip onto the underside of tables, allowing Her Majesty to hang her handbag neatly rather than placing it on the floor. Because let's be honest, no matter how many corgis you command or commonwealths you reign over, putting your purse on the ground is just bad form. This detail, tiny as it may seem, reflects the Queen's lifelong obsession with organization, decorum, and practicality. She was known for being prepared for anything. Rainstorm? Bring the clear umbrella. Uncomfortable chair? Deploy the cushion. Unclean surface? Handbag hook to the rescue. The portable hook also played into the Queen's other famous handbag trick, using it to send coded messages to her staff. Place it on the table? Things are fine. Shift it from one arm to another? Time to wrap up the conversation. Place it on the floor? Get me out of here. It was silent, seamless stage direction in the theater of diplomacy. The handbag hook didn't make headlines. It didn't glitter like a crown or make speeches like a prime minister. But it said everything about a monarch who understood that even the smallest detail, if executed with precision, could carry centuries of tradition. And just behind the Queen, always 2 steps behind, walked a figure who wasn't just an aide, but a living, breathing royal Swiss army knife in polished shoes. 89. The equerry. 2 steps behind, always ready. In the royal household, not all heroes wear capes. Some wear uniforms, carry clipboards, and hover exactly 2 steps behind. Meet the equerry, a position that sounds like something out of medieval fiction, but remains a vital piece of royal machinery to this day. An equerry is essentially a senior aide-de-camp, a mix of personal assistant, bodyguard, scheduler, and emergency fixer. Drawn from the ranks of the British Armed Forces, equerries are highly disciplined, impeccably trained, and always composed. Their job? Make sure the monarch, or any senior royal, gets from A to B without a single misstep. You'll often spot them in royal footage, the clean-cut figure trailing just behind the Queen, or now King Charles, silently observing everything. They carry spare gloves, backup pens, speech notes, schedules, and possibly divine patience. If something goes wrong, the equerry doesn't panic. They pivot. Equerries aren't lifers. They usually serve for about 2 to 3 years before returning to their military careers. But in that time, they get a crash course in royal protocol, diplomacy, international travel, and logistics on a scale most people never imagine. One of the Queen's most famous equerries was Major Tommy Lascelles, a man so influential he became a character in The Crown. Others, like Wing Commander Sam Fletcher, have become fixtures of royal tours, managing details from motorcades to banquets. And while they rarely speak publicly, equerries are often the quiet source of calm behind moments of royal elegance. They're the ones who hand over reading glasses just before a speech, or whisk away a flower bouquet just as the cameras flash. It's a role built on trust, discipline, and near invisibility. Because sometimes the most powerful people in the room are the ones making sure you don't notice them. And speaking of quiet statements, Even royal portraits have their own visual vocabulary, subtle clues tucked into a single glove or folded handkerchief. 90. The hidden codes. In royal portraits, gloves, hankies, and bragging rights. Royal portraits aren't just pretty pictures. They're propaganda machines, status updates, and subtle flexes, all rolled into canvas and oil paint. And if you look closely, you'll find a whole language hidden in the accessories, especially gloves and handkerchiefs. Take the glove. In portraits of monarchs and high-ranking nobles, a single glove, often held, not worn, wasn't about warmth or fashion. It was a symbol of refinement, wealth, and most of all, leisure. It said, "I'm so rich and powerful that I don't need to use both hands. One is enough, the other just holds status." Then there's the handkerchief. Today it might feel old-fashioned, but in portraiture, a delicately embroidered hanky wasn't just for wiping noses. It represented cleanliness, grace, and impeccable taste. In some cases, it hinted at personal grief or piety, especially when held by widowed queens or mourning royals. Artists used these items deliberately. A glove tucked into a belt, authority, draped across the palm, sensitivity, combined with luxurious fabrics, elaborate jewelry, and symbolic backgrounds, like dogs, loyalty, oranges, fertility, or ermine, purity. These accessories help communicate the sitter's personal brand before Instagram made it cool. Even the placement of the hands mattered. A hand resting on a sword or scepter signaled strength. One placed over the heart suggested virtue. A gloved hand resting on a document could imply intelligence or legal authority. Nothing was accidental. Every thread told a story. These visual cues helped reinforce hierarchy and control narrative, especially in an era when many subjects would only ever see the monarch in paint. And when King William and Queen Mary stepped onto the throne, they brought more than just political reform. They imported a whole new aesthetic, reshaping gardens across England with meticulous symmetry and continental flair. 91. William and Mary's Dutch Garden Revolution. When William III and Mary II ascended the English throne in 1689, they didn't just import new political ideas. They brought with them an entire aesthetic sensibility, straight from the manicured lanes of the Dutch Republic. And where did that aesthetic take root most famously? The royal gardens. At Hampton Court Palace, once the stomping grounds of Henry VIII's culinary chaos, William and Mary unleashed their vision. Geometric order, clipped yews, ornamental canals, and parterres so symmetrical they'd make a compass weep. Gone were the wild forested hunting grounds of Tudor days. In came precise lines, low hedges, and vast, flattened perspectives, designed not just for beauty, but for control. This wasn't just landscaping, it was a statement. The formal Dutch garden said, "We are rational, we are enlightened, we don't just rule the land, we organize it." William's influence is particularly visible in the construction of the Long Water at Hampton Court, a perfectly straight canal slicing through the grounds with mathematical grace. Inspired by Versailles but tailored to cooler British tastes, it transformed the royal gardens into places of both leisure and showmanship. Even garden paths became ceremonial runways, carefully laid out so visiting dignitaries would walk in awe through corridors of green geometry. These Dutch-style gardens set the stage for what would become the great tradition of English landscape architecture. Even as later monarchs like Capability Brown swept it all away with rolling hills and fake natural lakes. But before that, the formality reigned. Gardens were curated theater, where trees obeyed, flowers performed, and fountains stood like marble applause. And while the gardens were orderly, William and Mary's wardrobes, particularly William's, took a dramatic, dandyish turn when George IV came along and rewrote the royal fashion rulebook. 92. The Prince Regent and the Rise of Royal Corsets. George IV, before he was king, while still the Prince Regent, wasn't just a monarch in waiting. He was a walking fashion revolution, a royal peacock in human form. And yes, he wore corsets, tight ones. In the early 1800s, George IV helped usher in a new era of aristocratic style that was flamboyant, excessive, and tightly cinched. Gone were the powdered wigs and towering heels of previous generations. Enter the Regency dandy, a figure obsessed with tailoring, posture, and detail. George led this charge with gusto, strapping himself into rigid corsets to achieve the fashionable hourglass silhouette of the time. He didn't stop there. His wardrobe was vast, with suits made from the finest silks, cravats tied with mathematical precision, and tailcoats that hugged every curve, enhanced, of course, by that ever-present corset. His fashion icon? Beau Brummel, the original dandy and close friend of George, before they fell out in spectacular style. Brummel believed that true elegance lay in understated perfection, and George embraced this ideal, albeit with royal embellishment. If Brummel wore a perfectly tied white cravat, George wore 5, and made sure they cost a fortune. The Prince Regent also set grooming trends. He bathed daily, unusual for the time, and was obsessed with colognes and tooth powders. His vanity became legendary. By the time he became king, portraits often depicted him in flattering styles, airbrushed long before Photoshop. His over-the-top style mirrored his lifestyle, extravagant, indulgent, and deeply self-aware. He didn't just wear fashion, he performed it. And while George dressed for flair, one of his ancestors, Queen Victoria, dressed for resilience, especially when facing danger, over and over and over again. 93. Queen Victoria and the assassination attempts. She outlived. Queen Victoria reigned for over 63 years, and during that time, she survived at least 8 known attempts on her life. Not once, not twice. 8. Her resilience in the face of danger became legendary. Some of the attacks were downright theatrical. One man rushed her carriage with a pistol, which misfired. Another fired a shot while she was riding in Hyde Park. Yet another attacker actually tried to hit her with an iron-tipped cane. There was even a deranged ex-soldier who threw himself in front of her carriage in an attempt to cause chaos. But through it all, Victoria remained astonishingly composed. In one famous incident, after a gun was fired at her and Prince Albert, she reportedly told the coachman to drive on. She refused to be rattled, refused, in fact, to give attackers the satisfaction of seeing her afraid. And it wasn't all bravado. These attempts actually helped build her public image. The more she was attacked and emerged unscathed, the more she came to symbolize strength, stability, and divine right. The people rallied behind her, not just as their queen, but as a national figure who seemed untouchable. Security was beefed up, of course, and some would-be assassins were declared mentally unfit and institutionalized. But Victoria never let fear dictate her public appearances. She continued with processions, walks, and open carriage rides, always trusting that her presence meant more than her risk. Even her fashion evolved to match the narrative. Black dresses, after Albert's death, simple accessories, and a somber dignity that echoed her resolve. She became more than a monarch. She became an icon of imperial resilience. And while Victoria embodied mourning in velvet and lace, her ancestors wore robes lined with furs so lavish, they practically invented royal winter chic. 94. Royal robes. Lined with ermine tails, the snowfall of status. Ermine. It's not just a fancy word for a weasel. In royal circles, it's a fabric, a symbol, and a power move all rolled into one. For centuries, British monarchs, and their continental counterparts, have donned ceremonial robes lined with the pure white winter coats of stoats, tipped with black tails that look like scattered ink droplets on snow. The visual effect? Opulence. Pure, unfiltered luxury. These robes didn't just shimmer, they declared, Ermine became the de facto lining of coronation garments, parliamentary cloaks, and state regalia. To wear it was to say, "I am not like you. I am appointed by God, wrapped in snow, and possibly able to turn into a Disney villain at will." Historically, the use of ermine was tightly regulated. Only the upper crust, monarchs, peers, and high-ranking nobles, could sport the black-dotted white fur. In medieval sumptuary laws, there were actual restrictions based on rank. A count might get 6 rows of ermine spots, a duke, perhaps 10. The number of tails signified your place in the pecking order. Queen Elizabeth II's coronation robe in 1953 featured over 2,000 hand-sewn ermine tails. The train stretched 18 feet and took pages just to carry it. The velvet? Crimson. The trim? Gleaming. The statement? Absolute. Modern times have raised questions about animal ethics, of course, and synthetic alternatives are increasingly used for newer garments. But in the grand lineage of royal fashion, ermine remains a symbol of monarchical continuity, lavish, traditional, and more than a little theatrical. And if fur-lined cloaks weren't flashy enough, the next royal fashion trend took things in an even stranger direction. Because in the 19th century, Britain fell head over heels for a fruit, and not just to eat it. 95. Pineapples. The status fruit that crowned everything. In the 1700s and 1800s, if you were rich, refined, and just a little bit extra, there was one way to show it: pineapples. Not in smoothies, not on pizza, but everywhere else. Gates, bedposts, centerpieces, and garden ornaments, including royal properties. The pineapple, imported from the Caribbean and grown with difficulty in British hothouses, was a fruit so rare and expensive that owning, or even renting, one became a symbol of absurd wealth. One pineapple could cost the equivalent of thousands today. In fact, people often didn't eat them at all. They just displayed them. At royal events, pineapples were plopped atop elaborate tablescapes as edible sculptures, sometimes mounted like trophies. They appeared on royal gates as stone finials, carved with excruciating detail. Even Hampton Court Palace got in on the action, with gardens featuring stylized pineapple motifs, a nod to Britain's colonial reach and botanical ambition. Queen Charlotte, wife of George III, was particularly taken with the fruit. She encouraged the construction of pineapple houses, specialized greenhouses designed to maintain tropical heat. These were not humble sheds. They were ornate, gas-heated temples to fruit worship. The pineapple became such a symbol of status that it crossed into architecture. The famous Dunmore pineapple in Scotland, a massive stone fruit atop a garden house, is the crown jewel of this trend. And though it wasn't a royal building, its extravagance fit right in with the era's aristocratic fruit madness. Even today, pineapples appear in royal symbolism, on gates, crests, and decorative accents. A hangover from the days when having exotic fruit meant you ruled more than just people, you ruled taste. And speaking of taste, the modern royal family has an unexpected eye behind many of its most iconic family portraits. And she's more than just the Duchess of Cambridge. 96. Catherine, the Duchess of Cambridge. Royal photographer mom. It's one thing to be royal, it's another to be relatable. And Catherine, Duchess of Cambridge, now Princess of Wales, has managed to do both, with a DSLR camera in hand. While previous royal generations commissioned professional photographers for official portraits and family snapshots, Catherine flipped the script. Instead of a stage studio, many of the most heartwarming, widely shared images of the royal children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, have come from their mum. And she's not half bad at it either. Catherine studied art history at university and has long held a personal interest in photography. Over time, that hobby became something more. Her pictures, often released for birthdays or holidays, capture the children laughing in meadows, playing with pets, or clambering over rocks with muddy boots and gap-toothed smiles. The results are more candid, more natural, and far more modern than previous royal imagery. They humanize the monarchy in a way that feels deliberate, but never forced. It's monarchy with a touch of mumblogger, and it works. The choice to take these photos herself isn't just about aesthetics. It's about control. Catherine avoids the frenzy of paparazzi by providing the public with approved glimpses of her children, on her terms. It protects their privacy while still allowing a sense of access. In 2020, she even curated a public photo exhibition titled Hold Still, documenting life in the UK during the pandemic. The project was praised for its emotional range and community storytelling, proving her creative vision extends beyond her family. So yes, she's a duchess, a future queen, and a royal-style icon. But she's also the woman behind the lens, reshaping royal representation, one snapshot at a time. And when it's time to trade the camera for keys, she's just as likely to find herself off-road, in a royal Land Rover. 97. Queen Elizabeth II and her love for Land Rovers. If there was one vehicle that truly symbolized Queen Elizabeth II's style of royalty, unflashy, practical, and resolutely British, it wasn't a gilded carriage, it was a Land Rover. For over 7 decades, the Queen was inseparable from her fleet of rugged, off-road Land Rovers. From the Scottish Highlands to military inspections, Balmoral safaris to farm visits, Her Majesty wasn't just a passenger, she was often the one behind the wheel. And she drove like she meant it. One of the few people in Britain allowed to drive without a license, Elizabeth learned to drive during World War II, when she served as a mechanic and truck driver in the Auxiliary Territorial Service. That wartime training never left her. She remained an enthusiastic and confident driver throughout her reign, frequently seen navigating country roads with a headscarf tied under her chin and her corgis bouncing in the back seat. Land Rovers were her vehicle of choice not just for their sturdiness, but because they matched her brand of monarchy. No nonsense, capable, and grounded, literally. She owned over 30 models during her lifetime and was reportedly fond of modifying them with custom features, like heated seats and special dog ramps. When visiting estates like Balmoral and Sandringham, she often eschewed chauffeurs and took the wheel herself, guiding guests through muddy trails or checking in on her horses. Diplomats and heads of state were frequently surprised and charmed to find themselves being driven by the Queen of England in what looked like a luxury farm truck. Her Land Rover became so iconic that one was even used as the vehicle for Prince Philip's funeral procession at his personal request. But while the Queen's Land Rovers roamed the grounds, the palace interiors had their own hidden travelers, tiny feline-favored shortcuts known as mouse holes. 98. Royal mouse holes, the secret doors for palace cats. It turns out that even the grandest of royal palaces had to deal with a most unglamorous problem: mice. And long before pest control was a phone call away, the monarchy had a simpler, furrier solution: cats. But how do you allow royal mousers to patrol the halls of Buckingham Palace or Windsor Castle with dignity and efficiency? Enter the mouse hole. No, not the kind mice chew. These were custom, cat-sized openings built into palace walls, doors, and baseboards, tiny passageways to allow feline staff to move freely in pursuit of royal rodents. In some locations, they were cleverly hidden behind paneling. In others, they were proudly cut into the woodwork. Functional, yes, but also a small architectural nod to the importance of the palace cat. Cats have long played a role in British domestic life, and the royal household was no exception. Felines were cherished not only for their companionship, but also for their usefulness. While not every cat had a nameplate or a fancy collar, some did become minor celebrities in their own right, praised for their mousing prowess and regal aloofness. Queen Victoria, for instance, adored animals of all kinds and was known to keep cats around the palace. More recently, unofficial palace mousers have been spotted during tours and in offhanded comments by staff. The mouse holes remain, little doorways into the quieter, less ceremonious side of royal life. They're reminders that even among marble columns and priceless tapestries, nature finds a way, and so do the cats. And while those mouse holes are a nod to centuries of tradition, the next royal ceremony shattered expectations by turning up the volume, literally, with a surprise no one saw coming, a gospel choir in a coronation. 99. King Charles III's coronation and the gospel. First coronations are steeped in tradition. The rituals, the anointing oils, the oaths, all preserved like precious fossils in the cathedral air. So when King Charles III's coronation took place in 2023, most observers expected the usual pageantry. They got that. And then something very unexpected. A full-on gospel choir. Yes, really. For the first time in British royal history, a gospel choir performed during the coronation service. The Ascension Choir, an acclaimed UK-based group known for their vibrant harmonies and soulful delivery, sang Alleluia, O Sing Praises, in a moment that was both musically powerful and symbolically groundbreaking. Why did it matter? Because gospel, with its roots in African American and Caribbean traditions, has never before had a place in such a rigidly traditional, Anglican-centered service. Its inclusion was a deliberate move, a nod to modern Britain's multicultural identity, and an effort by Charles to reflect a more inclusive monarchy. The performance itself was joyful, warm, and deeply moving. Dressed in elegant white robes, the choir's harmonies echoed through Westminster Abbey with a vitality that felt more alive than ceremonial. It brought a new kind of spiritual depth to the service, one less about hierarchy and more about humanity. The moment resonated with audiences around the world, praised for its boldness and sincerity. It didn't rewrite tradition, it added to it, proving that even the oldest institutions can evolve without losing their soul. And yet, for all the pomp, all the innovation, the royals remain deeply human. They travel with Tupperware. They store cereal in plastic boxes. Because in the end, even kings and queens have breakfast. And sometimes, it comes in a snap-on lid. 100. Tupperware and cereal. The surprisingly domestic side of royal breakfast. You can picture it, a long oak table, antique silverware, sunlight filtering through Buckingham Palace windows, and somewhere, amid the marmalade and monogrammed napkins, there's a humble piece of Tupperware. Yes, really. Despite centuries of gilded formality, the royal family, especially Queen Elizabeth II, was known for certain down-to-earth habits. Chief among them? Storing breakfast cereal in plastic containers. This wasn't an internet rumor. Multiple royal insiders, including former palace chefs and footmen, have confirmed it. Her Majesty's breakfast setup included clear plastic boxes, often laid out with a selection of cereals for her choosing. Cornflakes, Special K, even bran flakes. Simple, everyday options kept airtight and fresh, just like your gran might do. These weren't ceremoniously poured into crystal bowls. No one summoned a butler to swirl them dramatically. The Queen would reportedly help herself, sometimes preferring the crunch of a basic cereal to anything elaborate from the kitchen. Why does this matter? Because it captures the quiet paradox of royal life. One foot in ancient ceremony, the other in ordinary routine. The Queen might have started her day with a golden spoon, but what was on it might have come from a box you'd find in any British supermarket. Palace chefs prepared elaborate meals when needed, of course, but breakfast was a personal ritual. Cereal, tea, and sometimes toast with marmalade. She even had her own preference for tea temperature, with milk added after pouring. A debate that still divides British households. The Tupperware story endures not because it's extraordinary, but because it's so ordinary. A monarch at the helm of an empire, casually popping open a plastic lid. It's the kind of detail that makes the crown feel human. And so, from golden orbs to pineapple finials, corgi trails to handbag hooks, we've seen how the British monarchy balances myth and minutiae Each fact a glimpse behind the velvet curtain. Long live the trivia.